Chapter 1. Sarah Thompson's eyelids fluttered open, to dawn's light streaming through her bedroom window. She rolled out of bed with a buoyancy that hadn't graced her mornings in years. Today was the day of the high school reunion, a milestone she'd been waiting for with a mix of eagerness and trepidation. Bounding across the room, she riffled through her closet, fingers dancing past hangers until they halted on the perfect dress, a soft, rose-hued number that hugged her curves just right. She slipped it on, admiring the way it made her auburn hair seem even more vibrant. "Today's about sweet remembrances," Sarah murmured to her reflection as she applied a touch of mascara, enough to make her eyes pop but not so much to mask the sincerity in her gaze. A dab of blush and a swipe of lip gloss, and she was ready to face memories old and new. Sarah locked her front door behind her and walked down the quiet streets of her Texas hometown, basking in the warm glow of familiarity. The tinkling bell above the bakery door heralded her arrival like a festive greeting. "Good morning, old friend," she chirped to the space within, feeling a kinship with the cozy warmth that filled her shop. She tied an apron around her waist and set to work, pulling ingredients from shelves with practiced ease. As Sarah kneaded the dough for her cinnamon rolls, the recipe that had started a small-town sensation, she allowed herself a moment of pride. The rolls were a symbol of how far she'd come, from a hopeful teenager with dreams of sweetness and success to the heart and soul of Sarah's sweets. "Who'd have thought," she whispered with a chuckle, rolling out the dough evenly and dusting it with cinnamon sugar. Her friends, they'd all grown too, spread their wings in ways they couldn't have imagined back when the future was a distant horizon to squint at. "Here's to us," she said, slicing the dough into spirals, each one a memory, a laugh shared, a tear wiped away in the company of those who knew her best. They'd see her today, not just as Sarah Thompson, baker extraordinaire, but as the woman who needed love into every part of her life. A sigh escaped her lips, a puff of contentment as she slid the tray of cinnamon rolls into the oven, the scent soon filling the bakery, a fragrant promise of sweet things to come. Sarah's heart thrummed like a well-oiled mixer as she parked her car under the dim glow of the community center's flickering streetlight. The evening air, scented with the day's warmth and the promise of nostalgia, wrapped around her as she stepped out, smoothing the fabric of her dress against her thighs. She took a deep breath, her pulse racing with the kind of anticipation that came from stepping into a piece of the past. The local community center, once the backdrop of teenage dramas and dreams, stood before her, its doors thrown open as if welcoming back lost children. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, clutching her small purse like a lifeline, then with a determined tilt of her chin, she crossed the threshold. The buzz of familiar voices enveloped her, and she scanned the sea of faces, all changed, yet unmistakably the same. Then, like a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog, she spotted them, Lola, Rachel, Danielle, and Natalie, clustered together across the room, their laughter reaching her before anything else. "Sarah," they chorused as she weaved through groups of former classmates, dodging half-hearted hellos and curious glances. Her steps quickened, and when she reached her friends, it was as if no time had passed at all. "Look at you!" Lola exclaimed, her lawyerly poise giving way to girlish glee as she pulled Sarah into an embrace that spoke of courtroom victories and late-night strategy sessions. Rachel, with eyes as warm as her caring smile, was next, holding Sarah just long enough to convey the depth of her journey into motherhood and real estate. "Couldn't have done it without your support," Sarah murmured, feeling the weight of shared struggles and triumphs in Rachel's touch. Danielle's hug was tinged with the scent of ink and paper, the embrace of someone who had battled through love's whims with nothing but words as her shield. "Your stories are my escape," Sarah confessed, squeezing Danielle's hands, thinking of the world spun from her friend's heartaches and hopes. Finally, Natalie, whose tired yet steady gaze peered over glasses that had seen too many night shifts, offered a grip that was both gentle and resolute. "Couldn't be prouder of you, Nat," Sarah said, acknowledging the sacrifices made in the pursuit of healing others. They stepped back, forming a circle that felt both exclusive and inclusive, a bubble of shared history amid the reunion's chaos. Stories unfurled like ribbons, tales of success and misadventure, of new beginnings and endings that were sometimes happy, sometimes not. "Remember when we thought we had it all figured out?" Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "More like muddling through adulthood," Danielle quipped, and they all nodded, a murmur of agreement humming between them. As they recounted the paths they'd carved since receiving their diplomas, a tapestry of life in vibrant hues, Sarah felt the glow of connection, the kind that only comes from knowing and being known. It was a sweetness no confection could match, a reminder that while her cinnamon rolls may have brought the town to her doorstep, it was the people inside who truly nourished her soul. "Here's to another 10 years of figuring it out together," Sarah toasted, her voice light, her heart full. "Cheers," they echoed, clinking imaginary glasses, their bonds sealed not by the drinks they didn't have, but by the laughter that flowed as freely as wine. As the laughter from her circle of friends waned, Sarah's gaze drifted across the room, settling on a figure by the refreshment table. There stood Jake Williams, leaning casually against the punch bowl stand. He was the tallest, sexiest, and most eligible man in town. His sandy blonde hair caught the warm light of the community center, and the blue of his eyes sparkled like the clear Texas sky after a summer storm. "Isn't that Jake Williams?" Rachel murmured, following Sarah's gaze. "Still as handsome as ever," Lola added with a wink. "Looks like he finally came back to town," Natalie noted, her tone neutral but curious. Sarah's pulse quickened, an involuntary response to seeing him after all these years. He had always been a few steps out of reach in high school, a mystery wrapped in charm. Now, standing there with a solo cup in hand, he seemed more approachable, yet every bit as intriguing. She knew he'd gone off to Texas A&M University to study after school, and she'd heard something about a master's degree in animal husbandry. Rumor was he was back in town to take the reins of his family's ranch from his father, who was retiring after a recent heart attack. "Go say hi, Sarah," Danielle urged gently, nudging her forward. With a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, Sarah stepped out of the safety of her group and made her way toward Jake. Her dress, chosen for comfort and a splash of confidence, swished around her knees. She felt its fabric brush against her skin, a reminder of the boldness she needed to muster. "Jake Williams," she said, her voice steady, despite the flutter in her chest. "It's been a long time." He turned, and those piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. The corners of his mouth lifted into a smile that was both familiar and new. "Sarah Thompson," he replied, his voice a smooth drawl that held a hint of surprise. "You look incredible." "Thank you," she laughed, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "I could say the same about you." "Guess we've both come a long way from the awkward days of high school," he remarked, taking a sip from his cup. "Definitely. I own the bakery in town now, the one on Main Street." "Ah, so you're the mastermind behind those addictive cinnamon rolls." His eyes twinkled with genuine interest, and Sarah felt a warmth bubble within her. "I think half the town's been trying to steal your recipe." "Guilty as charged," Sarah grinned. "But some secrets are worth keeping." "Can't argue with that. One of the ranch hands gets us all cinnamon rolls every Wednesday morning." "I've come to live for Wednesdays." Jake glanced around the room before looking back at her. "And what about you? What's your story since graduation?" "Plenty of stories, but mostly just life happening one day at a time," she shared honestly. "What about you?" "Last I heard, you'd left for college." "Did a bit of wandering after that," he admitted. "But I guess roads have a funny way of leading you back home." "Seems like they do," Sarah agreed, feeling an undeniable connection as they stood there, two former classmates rediscovering each other amid nostalgia. "It's really good to see you again, Jake." "Likewise, Sarah. It feels right to reconnect, especially here and now." Jake's gaze lingered, suggesting words left unsaid, but the message was clear. "Let's not wait another 10 years to do this again," she suggested, her heart daring to dance at the thought. "I definitely won't be waiting that long," he said with a chuckle. "I'll be sure to stop by your bakery soon. Maybe you can share a coffee, if not a cinnamon roll secret?" "I think that can be arranged," Sarah replied, the promise of future conversations wrapping around her like the sweetest of scents. The clang of forks against plates and the hum of conversation surrounded them, but in that little bubble, it was as if Sarah and Jake were alone. They had found a quiet corner, away from the thumping bass of nostalgic hits, where they could hear each other without shouting. "Never took you for a baker," Jake said, his blue eyes twinkling with mirth, "though I always figured you'd end up doing something that brought joy to people." Sarah laughed, tucking a loose strand of her auburn hair behind her ear. Well, I've always loved creating things. There's something magical about transforming simple ingredients into something that can make someone's day a little brighter. Agreed, Jake replied. I guess that's why I got into landscaping for a while. Taking a patch of earth and turning it into a garden, it's rewarding, seeing the literal fruits of your labor. Of course, I'm back to my roots and ranching again, but I miss the landscaping. Sounds like we both appreciate the simpler things, Sarah noted, her heart fluttering. Who would have thought that Jake Williams, the high school heartthrob, would have such a grounded perspective? As the night wore on, the air between them grew rich with shared stories and laughter. She learned about the places he'd traveled to, each tale sprinkled with insights that revealed more about the man he had become. In turn, Sarah spoke of her dreams, the bakery she had built from scratch, and the community projects that filled her with pride. Seems like you've planted roots here, Jake observed, leaning closer as if drawn by an invisible force. His gaze held hers, warm and searching. Maybe, Sarah conceded, feeling a warmth spreading through her chest. But there's always room for new growth, don't you think? Absolutely. His smile deepened, mirroring her budding hopes. Across the room, beneath the twirling disco ball, Lola, Rachel, Danielle, and Natalie watched the pair with knowing looks. Their grins were matched only by the frequency of their nudges and winks. Sarah caught her friend's gazes and felt a flush of self-consciousness mixed with gratitude. Looks like we have an audience, she murmured, gesturing subtly toward the group with a tilt of her head. Let 'em watch, Jake said confidently, though a blush crept up his neck too. They're just seeing what I'm feeling, that talking to you is the highlight of my night. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. She was no stranger to flattery, not with her bakery's patrons often singing the praises of her pastries to anyone who would listen, but this was different. The sincerity in Jake's voice was unmistakable, and it stirred something within her, a hope she hadn't realized was there. Then I guess we're giving them quite the show, she joked, but her gaze lingered on him, betraying the depth of her interest. Best act in town, Jake quipped back, his hand brushing against hers on the tablecloth, a touch as light as a butterfly landing, yet it sent shivers down her spine. Sarah looked over at her friends once more, their smiles unwavering. Their silent encouragement was a gentle push toward this new, unexpected chapter. Tonight, the past and present were blending sweetly, like the cinnamon in her rolls meeting sugar, irresistible and promising. And as the last song of the evening began to play, it seemed the future was waiting to be written, one shared dream at a time. The last of the streamers fluttered to the ground, a colorful reminder that all good things must come to an end. Sarah glanced at the clock, noting the reunion's impending close with a mix of reluctance and anticipation. She turned back to Jake, his piercing blue eyes reflecting the dimming lights as they shared a quiet pause in their conversation. Time flew by tonight, she said, tucking a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear. Sure did, Jake agreed, his gaze never leaving hers. I guess this is where we promise to keep in touch. Only if you mean it, Sarah teased, but the undercurrent of hope in her voice was clear as day. Jake's smile turned earnest as he took out his phone. I mean it. Numbers were exchanged, fingers brushing slightly as they passed back their phones, a touch electric enough to light up the entire community center. Sarah felt her heart doing somersaults as Jake locked her number into his contacts, sealing a promise that seemed filled with potential. Text me when you get home? Jake asked, the southern drawl in his voice wrapping around her like a warm blanket. Will do, she replied, her stomach aflutter with nerves and excitement. They stood there for a moment longer than necessary, neither wanting to break the connection just yet. See you, Sarah, Jake said, finally stepping back with a reluctant grin. See you, Jake. As Sarah walked out into the cooling Texas night, the stars above seemed to twinkle with the secrets of the universe, or maybe just the secret of what was blossoming between her and Jake Williams. The bakery welcomed Sarah back, with the familiar scent of sugar and spice. It was late, but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. Instead, she preheated the oven and began to prepare another batch of cinnamon rolls, the dough yielding easily under her practiced hands. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, each one spiraling back to Jake, the way he listened, the gentle strength in his hands, the way their laughter had mingled together so effortlessly. Could this be what she had been waiting for all these years? As she rolled out the dough, each sprinkle of cinnamon seemed to spark another memory from the evening. The warmth of Jake's smile, the encouraging glances from her friends, the soft glow of possibility that seemed to surround them both. Who knew cinnamon rolls could feel like hope, she mused aloud, a chuckle escaping her lips. She placed the tray into the oven, setting the timer, before leaning back against the counter. Her phone buzzed with a new message, and her heart raced with the thought that it might be him. She smiled down at the screen. It was indeed a text from Jake, confirming he got home safe and adding a winking emoji. "Good night, Sarah," the message read. "Sweet dreams, Jake," she typed back, her smile lingering as she slipped the phone into her apron pocket. In the quiet of her bakery, the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock were her companions, but Sarah felt anything but alone. With flour dusting her hands and the scent of baking cinnamon in the air, she sensed the dawn of something fresh and sweet. And with thoughts of Jake still dancing in her head, she couldn't help but feel hopeful about the possibilities that lay ahead. She was back at the bakery early the following morning. Saturdays tended to be the busiest day of the week, and she wasn't going to miss out on profits because she'd been up too late the night before. The chime above the bakery door tinkled cheerily as Sarah's friends filed in, their faces alight with curiosity and excitement. The cozy scent of freshly baked goods enveloped them, a perfect backdrop for the unfolding tales of last night's adventures. "Spill it, Sarah," Danielle implored as she hopped onto a bar stool, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "What's this I hear about you and Jake Williams?" Perched on the edge of the counter, Sarah felt a warm flush creep up her neck, her heart doing a little dance at the mention of his name. She tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear and launched into the story of their serendipitous reunion, her friends hanging on every word. "His eyes are still that piercing blue, like a clear Texas sky," Sarah gushed, her hands fluttering as if to paint the image in the air. "Girl, we always knew you had a thing for him," Rachel chimed in, nudging her gently. "And from what I saw, that spark hasn't fizzled out one bit." The group erupted into laughter, the sound mingling with the clatter of baking trays and the soft hum of the oven. Lola wrapped an arm around Sarah's shoulders, squeezing tight. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, hon," she said, her voice sincere. Natalie nodded, her smile reassuring. "You've got a heart of gold, Sarah. It's about time someone like Jake noticed." Sarah's chest swelled with gratitude, the love from her friends wrapping around her as comforting as one of her cinnamon rolls. In that moment, surrounded by the women who'd seen her through thick and thin, she allowed herself to bask in the warmth of their support. Later, after the last crumb had been swept away and the door locked behind her departing friends, Sarah let the quietness of the bakery wash over her. She leaned against the same counter where countless batches of dough had been rolled out, kneaded by hands that had grown stronger over the years. Memories of the reunion flickered through her mind, the laughter shared, the tears brushed away, the fond recollections of days past. But most vividly, she remembered Jake's genuine smile, the way he listened, really listened, and the gentle timbre of his laugh that seemed to resonate just for her. Her heart buzzed with the thrill of new beginnings. Sarah Thompson, baker extraordinaire, was no stranger to taking chances. Each creation that emerged from her oven was a testament to that. As she gazed out the window at the softening hues of dusk, she couldn't help but feel that life was offering up its sweetest recipe yet. "Here's to whatever comes next," she whispered to the fading light, a hopeful glint in her eyes. With an apron dusted in flour and a spirit sprinkled with dreams, Sarah was ready to embrace the journey ahead, wherever it might lead. Chapter 2. Sarah Thompson, with a dusting of flour on her apron and the sweet scent of vanilla in the air, meticulously squeezed a swirl of buttercream frosting onto the last of the chocolate cupcakes. She stepped back, admiring her handiwork, and wiped a rogue smudge of icing from her cheek. The tinkling sound of the bell above the door cut through the hum of the oven timers, pulling Sarah's attention from her sugary creations. She looked up, her eyes landing on the familiar figure of Jake Williams, his sandy blonde hair catching the light as he sauntered into the shop with that easy grin that seemed to make the whole room brighter. "Morning, Sarah," Jake called out, his voice smooth as caramel, while his piercing blue eyes twinkled with playful mischief that Sarah found both endearing and slightly unnerving. Hey, Jake, she replied, feeling the corners of her mouth lift into an involuntary smile. What can I get for you today? I'm in desperate need of a caffeine fix, Jake said, his eyes scanning the chalkboard menu above Sarah's head. And throw in a slice of that famous apple pie of yours. Need to make sure it's the best in town. Coming right up, Sarah responded, her heart doing a little two-step as she turned to grab a ceramic mug from the shelf. The rich aroma of coffee filled the air, blending with the buttery scent of baked goods. She poured the dark liquid with a steady hand, despite the tiny fluttering in her chest. As she slid the pie into the oven to warm, she couldn't help but glance back at Jake. You know, I've been thinking about renaming it Jake's Apple Pie. You've practically become its unofficial ambassador. He leaned on the counter, his blue eyes alight with humor. I'd be honored, but only if you admit it's my charm that makes it sell so well. Or maybe it's just really good pie, Sarah teased, placing the steaming mug on the counter. She cut into the golden crust of the pie, the filling oozing slightly, and carefully lifted a generous piece onto a plate. Could be, he conceded with a playful shrug, but I like to think I add a little extra magic to the mix. Magic, huh? Sarah chuckled, setting the plate down before him. Well, let me know if you're ready to reveal your secret ingredient. I could use a little more magic around here. Secret's safe with me, Jake winked, picking up his fork. But for you, I might consider a trade. How about the recipe for these cupcakes? Nice try, cowboy. Sarah grinned, leaning on the counter opposite him. Some things are worth keeping a mystery. Their laughter mingled, light and easy, as the morning sun continued to stream through the windows of Sarah's bakery, promising another day brimming with sweetness and possibility. Whoops! Sarah's exclamation was as quick as the reflex that had her reaching for a napkin. In the midst of their easy banter, her hand had jostled the coffee pot, sending a wayward splash across the counter and onto Jake's hand. Shoot. I'm so sorry, Jake. Her cheeks flushed a shade that matched the cherry filling of her pies as she dabbed at the small dark stain spreading on his skin. The warmth of his hand under hers for that fleeting second felt like it lasted both an instant and an eternity. Jake just chuckled, a sound as warm as the morning sun slanting through the bakery window. No harm done, Sarah, he said, waving off her concern with his free hand while he used the other to wipe away the spillage with the napkin she'd given him. I've had my share of close calls with hot coffee. It's a bit of an occupational hazard for us caffeine aficionados. Still, I should have been more careful, she muttered, even as relief washed over her. She couldn't help but notice how his smile never wavered, nor did those piercing blue eyes lose their twinkle. Accidents happen. Besides, he continued, pressing the napkin against his hand lightly, it gives me a good story to tell about the hazards of getting too close to the best pie in town. Or maybe it's a ploy to keep you coming back, Sarah teased back, regaining her composure. She watched as he tossed the napkin into a nearby trash can, his casual aim perfect. You caught me, he played along, grinning. I'm just here for the thrill of living dangerously around hot beverages and sharp-witted bakers. Sharp-witted, huh? I'll take that as a compliment, she said with a mock bow, glad to be back on familiar, flirtatious ground. Only the truth, ma'am, he replied, picking up his fork once more. The atmosphere in the bakery hummed with the usual morning activity, but between them, there lingered a comfortable silence filled with unspoken words and the lingering buzz of a new connection being forged. With a practiced swirl, Sarah topped off the final cupcake in the batch, her hand steady, despite the butterflies doing somersaults in her stomach. The bell above the door chimed its merry tune again as she glanced up, catching sight of Lola, Rachel, Danielle, and Natalie huddled together like conspirators at their usual table. Their eyes were fixed on her and Jake with an intensity that could rival the Texas sun. Girl, you're burnin' brighter than 4th of July fireworks, Lola whispered loud enough for only her circle to hear, her lawyer's scrutiny softening into a girlish gleam. Shoo, you'll jinx it, Rachel chided gently, her maternal instincts kicking in even here, among friends. Please, scoffed Danielle, flipping a strand of wavy hair over her shoulder. This is straight out of a romance novel. Clumsy encounters, lingering looks, undeniable chemistry. Natalie simply pushed her glasses higher on her nose, a silent observer cataloging every detail with a nurse's precision, knowing well the symptoms of a heart skipping beats. Sarah, oblivious to her friend's silent commentary, approached Jake with his order. She balanced the steaming mug of coffee on a small tray alongside a generous slice of apple pie, the scent of cinnamon and baked apples a sweet promise in the air. Her focus was entirely on not spilling anything else today, especially not in front of him. "Here we go, one coffee to wake you up and one pie to make your day," she announced, setting the tray down on the counter with a flourish that was more nerves than showmanship. "Thanks, Sarah," Jake replied, his voice easy like a lazy river. But as she went to hand him the plate, their fingers brushed ever so lightly, a fleeting touch that crackled with the static of a summer storm. "Oops, sorry," Sarah mumbled, heat crawling up her neck as she pulled her hand back as though singed by a flame. "No worries," Jake said, a lopsided smile taking root on his lips. He seemed momentarily frozen, his surprise mirroring hers. "Enjoy," she managed, retreating to the safety of her counter fortress, leaving Jake with his unexpected jolt and a piece of pie that suddenly felt like more than just dessert. The bell above the door jingled its soft goodbye as Sarah ducked her head, trying to hide the blossoming red in her cheeks. Jake's gaze lingered, a spark of something unspoken hanging between them like the delicate tendrils of steam rising from his coffee cup. Their eye contact was a silent conversation, smiles unwittingly stretching across their faces, too genuine to be anything but reflex. "Guess I'd better let you get back to it," Jake said, breaking the spell as he gestured vaguely toward the haven of her bakery counter. Was all Sarah could manage, her voice hitching in her throat as she scurried away, her pulse a wild rhythm against her wrist. Behind the safety of her display case filled with frosted confections, Sarah dared another glance. Jake had turned his attention to the pie, the fork poised like he was about to unearth treasure. The first bite was slow, thoughtful, and Sarah found herself holding her breath, willing it to be perfect. "Wow, Sarah," Jake finally spoke, his eyes lighting up as if he'd just discovered the secret ingredient. This is the best pie I've ever tasted." The compliment landed like a butterfly in her stomach, wings fluttering with a blend of pride and pleasure. "Really?" she asked, her voice steadier now, though she still clung to the countertop for support. "Really," he confirmed, the satisfaction in his tone sweeter than the sugar on her shelves. "Thank you, Jake," she said, a shy smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she busied herself rearranging pastry bags that didn't need rearranging. The rush of warmth in her cheeks didn't seem to want to fade, not that she really wanted it to. Sarah's fingers danced over the array of icing tubes as she spoke, her voice bubbling with an enthusiasm that echoed around the cozy confines of the bakery. "It's more than just a job for me, you know? It's like, every cake, every pie is a piece of art, a slice of happiness I get to share." Her eyes sparkled above a grin that stretched ear to ear, a blush still dusting her cheeks. "Sounds like a delicious mission," Jake quipped, his gaze lingering on her face, as if trying to memorize the way joy painted her features. She laughed, the sound mingling with the scent of vanilla and cinnamon in the air. "I suppose it is." Jake finished the last crumb of apple pie, pushing the plate away with a satisfied sigh. He took a long, final sip of his coffee, the rich aroma briefly masking the sweet fragrance that perpetually hung around Sarah's little sanctuary. As he rose from the red vinyl chair that squeaked in protest, his eyes stayed fixed on Sarah. "I'll be back, Sarah. Can't miss out on more of your culinary masterpieces," he said, a half-grin lifting the corner of his mouth. "Looking forward to it," she replied, her heart doing a somersault at the thought. She watched him stride to the door, his steps confident yet unhurried. The bell jingled a farewell tune, and Sarah was left with the echo of his promise hanging in the air, as tangible as the powdered sugar dusting her apron. No sooner had the bell above the door ceased its jingle than Sarah felt a flurry of excited whispers at her back. She turned to see Lola, Rachel, Danielle, and Natalie abandoning their half-finished lattes, their eyes alight with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for town festivals or surprise sales at the local boutique. "Girl, you two could light a fire with that spark," Lola exclaimed, waving her hands as if fanning flames. "Seriously, Sarah, there's something special there," Rachel chimed in, her voice a melody of encouragement. "Jake Williams, of all people." And he couldn't take his eyes off you, Danielle added, leaning on the counter with a conspiratorial grin. Natalie nodded fervently, her eyes dancing behind trendy frames. You have to go for it, Sarah. It's not every day Mr. Tall, blonde, and handsome walks into your life. Sarah's cheeks flamed hotter than her oven at full blast. She busied herself with wiping down an already spotless countertop, trying to hide the swarm of butterflies Jake's visit had left in her stomach. Y'all are reading too much into it, she said, aiming for nonchalance. He just came in for pie and coffee. Sure, and those cupcakes are just baked flour, Lola retorted with air quotes, eliciting a round of giggles from the group. Come on, Sarah, even the way you handed him that plate was like watching some old-timey romance, Rachel teased, batting her eyelashes dramatically. Enough. Sarah waved a flour-dusted hand through the air, though the twinkle in her eye betrayed her amusement. We're just friends, that's all. Friends don't look at each other like that, Danielle argued, winking at Sarah. Or accidentally brush hands sending shockwaves through the stratosphere, Natalie added, raising her eyebrows suggestively. Okay, I get it. Sarah conceded, laughter spilling from her despite her efforts to maintain a guise of indifference to their matchmaking schemes. Her heart, however, hammered against her chest, singing a hopeful tune she dared not voice aloud. The warmth of Jake's touch lingered on her skin, a silent testament to the undeniable connection she felt too. Mark my words, Lola said with a finality that felt like a prophecy, this is the beginning of something beautiful. Maybe, Sarah allowed, the word tiny but teeming with possibility. She tucked a stray auburn curl behind her ear and glanced out the window, wondering if someday there would be a new chapter of her story, one that included Jake Williams. Sarah scooped up the empty porcelain plate, traces of cinnamon and apple lingering on its surface. Her fingers danced along the edge where Jake's fork had clinked just minutes before, and she let out a soft sigh, her thoughts adrift in what-ifs and maybes. Sarah? Natalie's voice called from across the room, but it barely registered over the hum of daydreams filling Sarah's head. Earth to Sarah. Danielle chimed in with a chuckle, snapping Sarah back to reality. Sorry, just thinking, Sarah mumbled, feeling her cheeks warm again as she stacked the dish atop others in need of a good scrub. About Jake? Rachel asked, not so innocently. Maybe, Sarah replied, a coy smile curving her lips as she gathered the rest of the utensils. With each item she collected, her heart seemed to flutter like the wings of a hummingbird, quick and eager for the sweetness of nectar. She could still feel the electricity that had sparked between them, a current that seemed to charge the very air in her cozy bakery. The bell above the door jangled as another customer entered, pulling Sarah back into the rhythm of her work. But even as she turned to greet the newcomer with her signature blend of warmth and hospitality, her mind was a whirlwind of possibility. Jake will be back, she whispered to herself, allowing the words to fill her with a sense of anticipation. The thought alone made her pulse race, and she wondered if this was how the heroines in those romance novels felt, caught on the cusp of something thrilling and entirely new. Girl, you've got it bad, Lola teased from her perch by the window, drawing a laugh from the group. Maybe I do, Sarah admitted, the admission floating out like a secret she'd kept locked away too long. As she wiped down the table where Jake had sat, polishing away crumbs and smudges until the wood gleamed, she couldn't help but marvel at the turn her day had taken. What started as a morning filled with flour and frosting had blossomed into an afternoon tinged with the promise of romance. Could this really be happening? Sarah pondered, glancing at the door through which Jake had disappeared. Surely, life wasn't like the movies, but then again, sometimes reality had a way of surprising even the most grounded of souls. With every chair tucked neatly into place and the countertop shining, Sarah allowed herself one last look at the doorway, imagining Jake's return. And with that final, hopeful glance, she returned to her sanctuary behind the counter, her hands busy kneading dough but her heart soaring on the wings of possibility. Chapter 3. Sarah sat in her bakery, the comforting aroma of fresh pastry surrounding her. She absent-mindedly dusted flour off her apron, her eyes unfocused, lost in thought. It wasn't her latest batch of cinnamon rolls that had her so preoccupied, it was Jake Williams, with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right into her soul. Girl, you've got that look again, chided Lola, striding into the bakery with the confidence that came from being one of the top prosecuting attorneys in the state. Her dark hair swished as she claimed a seat at Sarah's table. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah asked, her cheeks flushing. "Only to anyone who's ever seen a human face," Rachel chimed in, her laughter warming the room as she followed Lola, balancing her daughter on one hip. "Spill the beans, sweetie." Danielle took a seat, her writer's notebook already forgotten as she pushed her wavy brown hair behind her ear. "Are we talking about Jake?" Natalie asked, sliding into the last chair, giving her feet a grateful rest from the day's nursing shift. Okay, Sarah surrendered, her hands wrapping around her coffee mug like a lifeline. "I think I'm ready to go for it with Jake. I can't shake this feeling that there's something real between us. I've never asked a man out before, but I think I'm about to do that very thing." Her friends exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing among them before they all turned back to Sarah, their faces a united front of encouragement. "About time, chica," Lola said, raising her cup. "You two have been dancing around each other for too long." "Jake would be lucky to have someone like you in his life," added Rachel. "Imagine the stories you'll tell," Danielle mused. "Life is meant to be lived." "Go for it, Sarah," Natalie urged. "We've got your back, no matter what." Sarah knew her friends were right, it was time to take that leap. And knowing she had these four incredible women by her side made the prospect of baring her heart to Jake seem not just less daunting, but exhilarating. "Okay," Sarah said, standing up with newfound resolve. "I'll ask him out." "Cheers to love and taking chances," Lola declared. She raised her coffee cup, and the others clinked their cups to it. Sarah took a deep breath. "Y'all are good for my ego." Sarah's fingers drummed a nervous rhythm on the countertop, her gaze fixed on the oven's clock. Any minute now, she'd slip out the back door of her bakery, as she ventured toward the coffee shop down the street. The shop where Jake spent his afternoons, buried in paperwork yet always surrounded by an air of approachability. "Come on, Sarah," she whispered to herself. "It's just asking him out, not proposing marriage." She practiced the words silently. "Would you like to grab dinner with me sometime?" "No, too casual." "Jake, I was wondering if you'd be interested in going out with me?" "Too formal." Mustering every ounce of courage, Sarah pushed through the bakery's back door. The walk to the coffee shop was short but felt like miles, each step a battle between her yearning and her trepidation. She drew a deep breath as she stepped inside, the scent of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon teasing her senses. Her eyes scanned the cozy interior, quickly locating the dark hair and cowboy hat that could only belong to Jake. He was seated at his usual spot by the window, his profile etched with concentration as he sifted through a stack of papers. "Okay, Sarah, now or never," she coached herself internally. Jake looked up then, as though he'd felt her presence, his eyes locking onto hers. A smile, warm and inviting, spread across his face, and for a moment, Sarah forgot her rehearsed lines. The world narrowed down to the space between them. "Hey, Sarah," Jake called out. "Hi, Jake," she replied. She approached his table, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. "Jake, would you like to go on a date with me?" The words tumbled out. Maybe it wasn't the way she'd rehearsed it, but it felt right. Sarah held her breath, watching as Jake's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked a lot like hope. Jake's eyebrows arched in genuine surprise. Then, like the sun breaking through clouds, his face lit up with a smile that reached his eyes. "Sarah, I'd love to," he said. "Really?" she asked. "Absolutely," Jake said. He leaned forward slightly, feeling as if others were watching them, but he didn't care. Going out with Sarah sounded like the best thing that had happened to him in years. "Saturday night?" she asked, doing her best to keep from doing a victory dance right there in the coffee shop. "Saturday night," he said. "I look forward to it." Later, Sarah recounted the encounter to her friends in Lola's cozy living room, the intimate space aglow with soft lighting and the buzz of shared excitement. Lola, Rachel, Danielle, and Natalie were perched on an assortment of couches and chairs, each one holding a wine glass, their faces filled with anticipation. His eyes, you guys, they just sparkled, Sarah said with a laugh. Of course, they did, honey. It's Jake we're talking about, Rachel chimed in, her tone playful and teasing. Did you see the look on his face? Was he surprised? Natalie leaned in, wanting every detail. Surprised and delighted, Sarah confirmed. I think he was as nervous as I was. Girl, you've got him wrapped around your little finger already, Danielle declared with a laugh, raising her glass in a mock toast. Lola glanced at Sarah. You took a chance, amiga. That's what life's about, right? Here's to taking chances, Sarah replied. They clinked their glasses together, and Sarah felt as if it was truly a celebratory occasion. The wine had dwindled to a mere glimmer at the bottom of each glass when Sarah leaned forward. Okay, so I picked the rustic fork for our date, she said, trying to steady her voice despite the swarm of butterflies in her stomach. Ooh, fancy choice. Lola's eyes sparkled with approval. Chef Martinez's steak is to die for. Exactly. Sarah nodded, picturing the cozy, dimly lit interior of the town's finest dining spot. I thought it'd be perfect, classy, but not too over the top. Are you kidding? Jake's gonna love it, Rachel interjected, almost as excited as Sarah. Ugh, I'm just so nervous, though. Sarah fiddled with the stem of her wineglass. What if there's an awkward silence or I spill something? Girl, please, Danielle waved a dismissive hand. You could spill a whole bowl of soup on him, and he'd probably find it adorable. Exactly. Just be yourself, Sarah. That's who he asked out, isn't it? Natalie reassured her. But I asked him out. Sarah protested. What if he's just going out with me to keep from hurting my feelings? You forget how charming you are when you're not trying to impress anyone, Lola added. Jake's already into you. Let things flow naturally. Trust your instincts, honey. You've got great ones, Rachel said. We'll go shopping Saturday afternoon, and get you some sexy underwear. I'm not sleeping with him or anyone else on the first date. Sarah said, laughing as she shook her head. No one thinks there has to be sleep involved, Lola said, wiggling her eyebrows at her friend. Remember that time you convinced Mr. Henderson to let us set up the bake sale outside his store? Danielle chuckled. You could sell ice to an Eskimo if you wanted. Speaking of which, make sure you tell him about your bakery adventures, Natalie suggested. Those stories are gold. Thanks, guys. Sarah felt their confidence. I can do this. It's just dinner, right? Right, they chorused. Here's to Sarah, Lola declared, who's going to knock the boots off Jake with nothing but her sparkling self. Knock the boots off? Sarah laughed, shaking her head at Lola. Hey, it's Texas. We say things like that here, Lola said with a grin. Yeehaw, then, Sarah joked back. Sarah's fingers danced along the hangers in her closet, skimming over fabric and color as she hummed a tune that had been stuck in her head all day. With a decisive tug, she pulled out a sundress that hugged her curves just right, a splash of coral against her pale skin. Perfect, she whispered to herself, her voice tinged with a hopeful lilt. The dress fell into place as if it were made for this very moment, and Sarah twirled in front of her full-length mirror, the skirt flaring out around her knees. A giggle escaped her lips, part nerves, part excitement. She reached for her makeup bag, unzipping it to reveal an array of brushes and palettes. With each stroke of mascara and dab of blush, Sarah transformed herself into the big beautiful woman she knew was hidden inside her. All right, Sarah, she muttered, giving herself a final look in the mirror. You can do this. Taking a deep breath, she let it out slowly, trying to calm her nerves. The drive to the restaurant was a blur of stoplights and familiar streets, but Sarah barely noticed. She arrived at the restaurant, wishing she didn't feel so nervous. At least she was pleased with her appearance, and she hoped Jake would be as well. For a split second, Sarah lingered outside. Then, squaring her shoulders, she pushed inside. The scent of garlic and fresh bread enveloped her as she scanned the room. And there he was, Jake, sitting at a table by the window. He was even more handsome than she remembered, the lines of his shirt complementing the broadness of his shoulders. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them, a spark that seemed to ignite the air around them. Jake's lips curved into a smile that. "Hi," she said as she approached the table. "Hey, Sarah," Jake replied ring. "You look amazing." "Thank you," she managed, feeling her cheeks heat with a blush. "You clean up pretty nice yourself." He chuckled. As he stood to pull out her chair, their hands brushed, a fleeting touch, yet it sent shivers down her spine. "I'm glad you picked this place. I used to come here all the time with my parents, but I had forgotten how much I love it. Maybe it can be our place as well." "I'd love that," Sarah agreed, taking her seat. As they settled into the evening, the initial rush of nerves gave way to anticipation. This was it, the start of something new. And for Sarah, who had always put her heart into everything she baked, it felt like totally new territory. She'd focused so much on building up her bakery and her clientele that it felt like the first time she'd taken any time for herself in years. Oh, she'd spent time with her friends. She'd helped Rachel when her husband had run off to follow a rock band. She'd spent late nights helping Rachel cram for her real estate license, and she'd helped Lola pass the bar by quizzing her about different laws. She'd helped Natalie study the bones and muscles of the body for her nursing degree. And Danielle was the one she'd spent the most time with. They had plotted many romances sitting together in Sarah's living room while drinking wine. Neither had been sure whether the wine helped or hindered, but they had come up with some hilarious outlines. All in all, she had a good life, but she'd always felt something was missing, and that something was Jake. She looked up at him, realizing he was watching her. Embarrassed to be caught lost in thought, she looked down at the menu. "Sorry. I was lost in my own little world for a moment or two." The clink of silverware and soft hum of conversation provided a comfortable backdrop as Sarah and Jake launched into a lively exchange. They swapped stories about their childhoods, tales that painted vivid pictures of scraped knees and treehouse adventures. "Okay, so there I was, right? 10 years old and convinced I could fly if I just jumped hard enough off the porch," Jake said, making grand gestures with his hands. Sarah giggled, nearly spilling her water. "And? Did you manage to take off?" she teased, leaning forward, her dark hair cascading over her shoulder. "Let's just say gravity won that round," Jake admitted with a self-deprecating grin. "But hey, it sparked my love for physics, which thankfully kept my feet firmly on the ground." "Speaking of feet on the ground," Sarah said, "I once entered a 3-legged race at our town fair. I was determined to win, but my partner was more interested in the cotton candy stand." She shook her head, lips curving with the memory. "We didn't win the race, but we did end up with the biggest sugar rush in Texas history." Their shared laughter felt like a deep intimacy, even as the world bustled around them. It wasn't just humor that connected them, but the realization that they both cherished their roots, valued hard work, and weren't afraid to laugh at themselves. As the night wore on, the din of the restaurant began to fade, signaling the end of their time together. Reluctance hung heavy in the air as they stood outside the restaurant. "Tonight was..." Sarah started, searching for the right words. "Special," Jake finished for her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Agreed," she nodded. "Sarah, I'd like to do this again," Jake said earnestly, his gaze steady. "Soon." "I'd like that too," she replied. "Soon." They lingered there for a moment longer, the promise of future dates unspoken but understood. Finally, he leaned down to kiss her cheek, whispering, "Sweet dreams, Sarah." Then he headed to his car, and though she wasn't ready for the night to be over, she got into her car. Minutes later, she was home. Sarah closed the door behind her and leaned against it, a blissful sigh escaping her lips. The house was quiet, but inside Sarah, everything was humming with life, like the cheerful buzz of her ovens in full swing. She kicked off her shoes and padded across the cool tile floor, her mind replaying the evening's highlights. "Wait till I tell the girls," she whispered to herself. The way his laughter had mingled with hers, the ease of their conversation, the shared stories, it all felt like the first chapters of a story she had been waiting all her life to tell. She reached for her phone, eager to text Lola, Rachel, Danielle, and Natalie, but paused. Some tales deserve to be told in person. This was one of them. Climbing the stairs, her thoughts danced ahead to tomorrow, to the smiles and shrieks of delight that would greet her news. But as she prepared for bed, the thrill of anticipation began to mingle with a whisper of uncertainty. What did this mean for her and Jake? Just as she was about to switch off the bedside lamp, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Jake. Can't stop thinking about tonight. Sweet dreams, my Sarah. With a contented smile, she finally turned off the light, the darkness doing little to dim the glow inside her. Drifting toward sleep, Jake's face was the last thing in her mind. She fell asleep with a smile on her lips and so many hopes for the future. Chapter 4. Sarah Thompson sat surrounded by her tribe of friends in the cafe the following afternoon. She cradled a steaming mug in her hands as she leaned forward with a gleam in her eyes. Okay, spill it, Sarah, Rachel urged. Jake Williams is nothing short of a Southern gentleman, Sarah declared. He held the door, pulled out my chair. I mean, who does that anymore? Sounds like you've been hit by the love bug, Danielle said with a grin. Or smitten with a capital S. Natalie took a sip of her own coffee, watching Sarah's expression over the rim of her mug, but it was Lola Sanchez who cut straight to the chase. With a hearty laugh, she teased, "Look at you, all Twitter-pated over cowboy charm and blue-eyed stares." Sarah's cheeks flushed a shade pinker, but her laughter joined Lola's. Can you blame me? It's like he stepped right out of a romantic novel, the strong, silent type with a hint of mystery. She shrugged. I didn't think guys like him really existed, especially not here in Butterfly. Girl, we're in Texas. Cowboys are around every corner, Lola said. But a Jake Williams is a rare find. Exactly. He's different, Sarah insisted, and he actually listens when I talk. It's like he sees me, you know? I mean, how am I supposed to just sit around, waiting to see if he'll call for a second date? She fidgeted with the charm bracelet around her wrist, the tiny cupcake and whisk glinting in the morning light. Patience, sweet Sarah, cooed Danielle. Love isn't a batch of cookies, you can't just set a timer for when it's ready. But before the others could chime in, the sound of Sarah's phone cut through the hum of conversation. 4 pairs of eyes shot toward her as she fished the device from her purse. The caller ID flashed Jake's name. Answer it, hissed Lola. With a shaky breath, Sarah brought the phone to her ear. Hello? Hey, Sarah, it's Jake. Look, I know it's probably too soon to ask, but would you let me pick you up around 6 tonight? I've been thinking about you all morning, and truth is, I can't wait to see you again. A bubble of laughter escaped Sarah, the sound mingling with relief and surprise. I'd love that, Jake. 6 is perfect. Great, Jake replied, the smile evident in his voice. It's a date, then. As she ended the call, Sarah felt her friend's collective gaze. Her smile was unstoppable, spreading across her face. Looks like you don't have to wait after all, Lola said, her eyes twinkling. Mr. Can't wait to see you again, strikes while the iron's hot. I guess he does, Sarah chuckled. At least I know we're on the same page. Instead of in different sections of the library like you were with James? Danielle asked. Sarah sighed. I don't know why I ever went out with that creep anyway. Sarah couldn't keep her eyes off Jake's face as his truck pulled up to the front of the Rustic Spoon, Butterfly's quaint little eatery that had seen more first kisses than any other spot in town. Here we are, Jake announced. He reached over to squeeze her hand gently before they stepped out into the evening breeze. Smells like heaven, Sarah commented. Her bakery was her sanctuary, but tonight, she relished the thought of being on the other side of the counter, savoring something new. Only the best for our second date, Jake replied, holding the door open for her. There was an ease about him, despite the flicker of anticipation in his eyes that told Sarah she wasn't alone with how she felt. Once inside, they were greeted with the soft strumming of a guitar from a local musician tucked in the corner, serenading diners with gentle country melodies. The hostess, recognizing Jake immediately, led them through the symphony of clinking glasses and murmured conversations to a cozy table near the window. Wow, this is perfect, Sarah said, taking in the view of the main street she knew so well. Thought you might like it, Jake said as he pulled out a chair for her. Thank you, Jake, Sarah said, locking eyes with him. For all of this. Thank you for saying yes, he countered. They shared a smile, and for a fleeting second, Sarah imagined that the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Let's make a toast, Jake suggested, lifting his water glass. To unexpected calls and the courage to follow through. Sarah clinked her glass against his. And to second dates that feel like the continuation of the first. The tinkle of the entrance bell broke through their shared reverie as a figure loomed in the doorway. Sarah's gaze instinctively flicked toward the sound, her heart hitching as recognition set in. The broad shoulders and confident stride belonged unmistakably to James, her ex-boyfriend. Is that? Jake trailed off. James, she confirmed. James's eyes locked onto theirs, a smirk playing across his lips as if he'd stumbled upon a particularly juicy piece of gossip. He made a beeline toward them. Sarah, fancy seeing you here, James said, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads as he arrived at their table. James, Sarah replied, striving to keep her tone neutral. This is Jake. Jake, huh? Heard about you. James leaned against the edge of their table. Mind if I join you for a second? Actually, we were just, Sarah began, but James interrupted her response. Great place, isn't it? Though, I'm surprised to see you here, Sarah. You always said this place was too fancy, he teased. Sarah fought to keep her composure. She could feel Jake's gaze on her, a silent offer of support. With a deep breath, she smiled politely, refusing to let James rattle her hard-won confidence. Things change, James, she said. And so do people. Clearly, he said, casting a look at Jake. Well, don't let me interrupt your date. I'll catch up with you another time, Sarah. Goodbye, James, she said firmly. As James sauntered away, Sarah let out a sigh, feeling her pulse begin to settle. A small, grateful smile curved her lips. Jake leaned back in his chair, an easy smile playing across his lips as he watched James's retreat. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against Sarah's hand in a silent gesture of camaraderie. Well, that was interesting, he said. Sarah laughed. You could say that again, she replied. Sorry about that. Hey, no apologies needed. Jake's voice was firm, reassuring. His blue eyes locked onto hers, steady and unwavering. We all have our histories. Doesn't mean they have to define us. Thank you, Jake, she said. For being so cool about everything. Trust me, Sarah, I'm not always this cool, he joked lightly. But for you, I can try. And as they turned their attention back to the menu, Sarah felt herself relax truly and completely. With Jake, she might just have found a partner who could handle the recipe of her life, no matter how complicated the ingredients. Sarah toyed with her napkin. You know, Jake. I never really wanted to date James. He asked and I didn't think you were coming back. She glanced up at him. Jake's expression softened. Back to Butterfly? He asked. She nodded. I thought you'd left for good. And then, when you came back. Sarah. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. I came back for many reasons. But finding you here, that's what made me stay. Being with James, she started, it was never about connection. He had his expectations. Expectations? Jake tilted his head. Of me, of how I should look. Sarah sighed. He said I'd be prettier if I lost weight, that he was ashamed to take me places. Sarah. No, it's okay. She lifted her chin. Those words, they hurt, but they made me who I am today. Jake's grip on her hand tightened just enough. You're incredible, Sarah. And for what it's worth, I think you're stunning, inside and out. Truth is, I've got my own suitcase full of insecurities. His chuckle was soft. This town knows Jake Williams, the guy who came back to run his father's ranch, but but they don't know the rest. Outsider, huh? Sarah searched his face. Something like that. He released a breath, the confessions unfurling. My past isn't a storybook tale, and sometimes I feel like I'm still on the outside looking in, even though Butterfly's been good to me. Jake, we all have our stories. Sarah gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. But maybe it's those very things that make us fit together, like puzzle pieces from different sets that somehow click. Is that so? A playful glint sparked in his gaze. Absolutely. She grinned, the warmth in her chest spreading like a sunrise over the plains. And I have a feeling our pieces are aligning just right. Then let's keep building this picture, Jake said. Sarah twiddled the stem of her wine glass, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. To think, I used to believe my quirks were just stumbling blocks, she said. Quirks? Jake leaned in. You mean your superhero ability to pair cupcakes with people's personalities? Exactly that, Sarah said. I've turned what used to be fodder for mockery into building my bakery. And here I am, living my dream, one sugar rush at a time. Hey, there's nothing wrong with bringing happiness through pastries. Your turn, she prodded gently. There must be dreams tucked away under that mysterious exterior? Jake's gaze drifted toward the window, where the fading sunset bathed Butterfly in golden hues. I guess, he started slowly, I'm trying to pull my dad's ranch out from the mountain of debt his illness created. I thought I'd come, take care of that, and leave. But, after seeing you again, I realized there's a lot more to Butterfly, Texas than I remembered. He glanced back at her. I think I'm going to make a go at ranching. And maybe even starting a family. Sounds like we're both searching for the same thing, huh? Seems that way. Jake reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. Someone who gets it. Someone who knows life's not all smooth roads and sunny days. Someone who'll stand by you when the storm hits, Sarah added. Exactly. Jake gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. Jake, I want more than just fleeting moments, Sarah confessed, her eyes locked on his. Me too, Jake agreed. Something real, something that lasts longer than a Texas heatwave. Supportive, right? Like two pillars holding up the same roof. Her metaphor drew a nod from Jake. Two pillars, he said, stronger together. Stronger together, Sarah whispered. The words hung between them, a fragile possibility. Can I tell you something? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Anything, Jake replied, leaning in. She toyed with her napkin, folding and unfolding the cloth, as if in its creases she could find the courage she needed. Back in high school, I was the girl people overlooked. She paused, her heartbeat quickening. I didn't fit into any mold, and that was lonely. Sarah, Jake said, high school is a battlefield of insecurities. Believe me, I know. He chuckled without humor, his hand reaching out to stop her fidgeting by covering her hands with his own. I was the kid who was always a little out of sync with the others. I didn't really do the sports thing because my dad kept me so busy on the ranch. I went to school, and then I went home. That was my life back then. Must have been hard, she murmured. Wasn't easy, but it taught me something important. His thumb stroked the back of her hand lightly. It taught me that the opinions of others don't define us. He was someone who understood what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. And who did you define yourself to be? She asked. Still working on that, Jake admitted with a wry grin. But I'm aiming for the guy who makes Sarah smile. Her laughter bubbled up, clear and genuine, breaking the tension that had bound them. It felt like shedding a layer of armor she hadn't realized she'd been wearing. Jake, there's this idea I've always had, about love. Sarah's words tumbled out. Love should make you feel like you're home, no matter where you are. Safe and accepted. Exactly. His eyes sparkled with the reflection of candlelight between them. No pretenses, no masks. Just two people being their true selves. Scary thought, isn't it? Being completely seen. She tilted her head. Terrifying, he agreed, but exhilarating too. Like we're both on the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. Jake, she said, her hand squeezing his gently, no matter what happens, I'm glad we jumped. Me too, Sarah. Me too. Chapter 5. Jake's pickup truck came to a soft halt outside Sarah's cozy white house. She hopped down from the passenger seat, her boots thudding gently against the gravel driveway, and glanced back at him with a hesitant smile. Do you want to come in for a bit? She asked. Sure, Jake replied, his drawl slow and easy as Texas summertime. He followed her up the creaky wooden steps, hands in his pockets. Inside, the home smelled of vanilla and cinnamon, remnants of a day spent baking. Sarah led the way to the kitchen, her movements as natural as the swaying of wildflowers in the breeze. Make yourself comfortable, and I'll grab us some tea, she said, already reaching for the tall glasses in the cupboard. Sweet tea? Jake's eyebrow quirked up, a playful twinkle in his eye. Of course, Sarah chuckled. It's practically the state drink. Do you think I'd risk going to prison by serving it unsweet? Not if you're a real Texan, Jake mused. Their fingers brushed, and for a second, electricity seemed to crackle in the tiny space between them. They settled into the living room, easing onto the well-loved sofa that was as inviting as Sarah's sunny disposition. The tea was cool and refreshing, the perfect antidote to the lingering heat of the day. Man, this hits the spot, Jake said, tipping his glass toward her in a silent toast. You know how to treat a guy right, Sarah. Only the best for my guests, she replied with a wink, leaning back against the cushions. Her laugh was a melody that filled the room, disarming and genuine. Amid sips of tea and shared smiles, they chatted about everything and nothing, a quilt of conversation stitched together with laughter and the occasional comfortable silence. It was the kind of night that didn't need fancy trimmings or grand gestures, just two people, sweet tea, and a connection. Thanks for inviting me in, Jake said after a while, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. Thanks for coming, Sarah replied, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird eager to soar. The evening might be winding down, but something inside her whispered that their time together was just beginning. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed, its deep bongs, counting down to midnight. Jake stretched his legs out, one boot gently tapping against the leg of the coffee table. So, what's the grand plan for the ranch? She asked, tucking a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear. Ah, the grand plan, he said, leaning forward. Well, I've been thinking about expanding the stables, maybe get into breeding quarter horses. Quarter horses, huh? You've got an eye for 'em? Sure do, Jake said with a confident nod. And something is fulfilling about working with animals, you know? Watching them grow, training them, feels like shaping the future in a small way. Sounds like you've given it plenty of thought. She admired his ambition, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his passions. It was the same way she felt about baking. Enough about me and my horse dreams. How about your bakery? Got any new recipes you're cooking up? He quipped, shifting the focus back to her with a twinkle in his eye. Maybe I do, Sarah teased, but a baker never reveals her secrets. Fair enough, Jake conceded, with a chuckle. Time slipped away from them as they delved deeper into conversation, their words weaving a tapestry of shared aspirations. When the clock struck midnight, it caught Jake by surprise. He unfolded himself from the couch and stretched. I should probably head out, he murmured. Sure, let me walk you to the door, Sarah offered. They stood in the entryway just looking at each other for a moment. Jake turned to face her. Sarah, he began, but whatever words he meant to say were lost as he leaned in. She met him halfway, their lips touching in a soft, tentative kiss. Their first kiss was a hesitant whisper. When they finally parted, the world seemed a little brighter. Good night, Sarah, Jake whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Good night, Jake, she replied. The stillness of the night wrapped around them as Jake's lips lingered on hers, a hesitant touch growing bolder by the heartbeat. Sarah's fingers found their way to his shirt, clutching the fabric. Each breath they shared stoked a fire that had been smoldering since she first laid eyes on him. Sarah, he whispered against her lips. Jake, she breathed back, her voice a mere whisper. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the kiss ended, leaving her gasping for air. Jake stepped back, his piercing blue eyes still locked with hers, as if to memorize the way she looked right now, flushed, breathless, utterly his. "Good night, Sarah," he said again. "Good night, Jake," she managed, though her voice sounded foreign to her ears. He turned and walked into the night. Left alone, Sarah leaned back against the door, her hands pressed flat against the wood as if to steady herself. Her legs felt like they were made of over-whipped meringue, shaky and too soft. She touched her lips, still tingling from his presence, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The moon had long since climbed to its zenith by the time Sarah's restless energy guided her out of the quiet house and into the pre-dawn stillness. The bakery was a sanctuary where she could lose herself in the rhythm of kneading dough and the precision of measuring ingredients. She rolled out pastries and piped delicate designs onto cakes. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her mind replayed the scenes from earlier that night, the feel of Jake's lips on hers, the way her name sounded laced with his drawl. With only a couple of hours left before the bakery would open, Sarah trudged home. She fell into bed, her body sinking into the mattress, while her mind spun with dreams of Jake. Sarah blinked groggily and stretched, the room spinning briefly before settling back into place. Her limbs felt heavy, but her heart was light, a fluttering in her chest that reminded her why sleep had been so elusive. She slipped into her apron, just as the bell above the bakery door chimed. Jake walked in, as though he was a part of the morning routine as much as turning on the open sign. His smile was enough to chase away any remnants of fatigue. "Morning, Sarah," he greeted. "Good morning, Jake," she replied, her cheeks warming. Sarah maneuvered behind the counter as she assembled Jake's order. She offered him a box filled with an assortment of pastries, her signature cinnamon rolls sitting proudly on top. As she handed it over, her fingers deliberately grazed his, a spark igniting at the contact that seemed to slow time for a heartbeat or two. "Hope these sweeten up your day," she said. "Can't get any sweeter than this," he quipped, holding her gaze as their fingers reluctantly parted. He leaned against the counter, and in that moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. "Say, Sarah," Jake started, the corners of his mouth hinting at a knowing smile, "you got any plans tonight?" She felt the now familiar flutter in her stomach. Her mind raced through her schedule, a mental checklist of dough to knead and cakes to frost, but the thought of spending another evening with Jake made everything else seem trivial. "Plans?" she asked. "I think I could shuffle some things around." "Great," he said, his blue eyes lighting up. "How about I swing by after closing? Maybe take a little drive out to see the stars?" "Sounds perfect," Sarah replied. She watched him walk away, his stride confident and easy. The man had impressive shoulders, and she couldn't look away. He really got her motor running. Sarah locked up the bakery, her apron still dusted with the day's work. She turned to find Jake leaning against his truck, a playful glint in his eye. "Ready for our starlit escapade?" he asked. "Absolutely," she replied, though a yawn betrayed her exhaustion. "But I might have to call it an early night." "Understandable," he said. "Running a bakery's no piece of cake." They drove just outside Butterfly and climbed onto the hood of his truck. Sarah missed on her first couple of attempts, so Jake laced his fingers together to help her up. Once they were seated, they both looked up at the starlit sky. "Sarah," Jake said, "you do realize it's our third date, right? Historically speaking, that means it's time we get busy." She froze. Was this the same man who'd lingered at her counter, whose eyes held so many secrets? Then she caught it, the twitch of his lips, the crinkle around those blue eyes, and relief washed over her mixed with a splash of indignation. "Oh, you're hilarious," she said, nudging him with her shoulder. "Admit it, you love my sense of humor," he teased, bumping her back gently. "Maybe just a smidge," she confessed, smiling despite herself. The night wrapped around them, a cozy blanket softening the edges of the world. It was getting late, far later than she had intended, but in that moment, Sarah couldn't bring herself to regret a single second. After a short while, they headed back into town. Sarah stood on her front porch, facing Jake. "Thanks for another great evening, Sarah," he said, his voice low. Anytime, Jake, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The air between them was thick with anticipation. Then he leaned in closer, tilting his head ever so slightly. Her breath caught as his lips brushed against hers. She reached up, her fingers finding the warmth of his arms. The kiss deepened, and Sarah found herself melting into him. As they finally parted, he smiled, a genuine curve of lips that spoke volumes without a single word, and touched her cheek with a reverence that sent shivers down her spine. "Good night, Sarah," he murmured, his thumb caressing her jawline. "Good night," she echoed, watching him walk away, each step echoing in the quiet street until he disappeared into the shadows beyond. Leaning back against the door, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe, to register the thundering of her heart against her ribs. The sweetness of his kiss lingered on her lips. But one thought rose above the rest: could she ever feel whole again if she lost him? Shaking her head as if to dispel the thought, Sarah retreated inside, locking the door behind her but unable to lock away the sensation of Jake's kiss, or the fear that now clung to her like morning fog. It was too soon to think of losing him. She'd only just found him. Chapter 6. Sarah and Jake sat on a checkered blanket in Sarah's favorite park. "Okay, your turn," Sarah prompted, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "What's the most outrageous thing you've ever done?" Jake ran a hand through his sandy hair, considering. "Well, there was this one time his story cut short as Sarah's phone buzzed, an intrusive sound that seemed out of place in their little bubble of bliss. "Sorry, just one sec," Sarah apologized, her brows knitting together as she read the notification lighting up her screen. Jake watched the worry lines form on her forehead and felt a twinge in his chest. He reached out, covering her hand with his own. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with concern. Sarah sighed, the weight of her world evident in the exhalation. She showed him the screen, an email from the bank, its subject line screaming overdue loan payment notice in bold letters. "Looks like the bakery's financial woes aren't taking a day off," she said, trying to keep the mood light despite the pang of anxiety. "Hey," Jake said, squeezing her hand gently, "you're the most creative and determined person I know. We'll figure this out, together." Her smile returned, albeit a touch more subdued than before. "Thanks, Jake. That means a lot." "Come on," he urged, standing up and pulling her to her feet. "Let's not let this spoil our date. The ducks at the pond haven't seen us yet, and I hear they've been gossiping about our absence." A genuine laugh escaped Sarah as Jake led her toward the water. As they walked, she tucked the phone away, determined to focus on the present, a present that included Jake's comforting presence and a flock of nosy ducks awaiting their grand entrance. Sarah's laughter faded into the dusk as the evening shadows stretched across the park. The ducks had long retired to their hidden nests, leaving her and Jake alone. They sat quietly on a bench, his arm around her shoulders, the warmth of his body a comforting contrast to the coolness of the night. "Everything okay?" Jake asked, his voice cutting through the peaceful silence. She nodded quickly, too quickly perhaps, but the furrow in her brow betrayed her inner turmoil. "Just thinking about the bakery," Sarah replied, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. The touch of his hand was a balm, yet it couldn't soothe the churning worries that plagued her mind. Jake leaned in, his blue eyes searching hers. "You're juggling a lot, Sarah. It's okay to be stressed." "Is it?" she mused aloud, but mostly to herself. Her bakery was more than just a business, it was her dream wrapped in brick and mortar, frosted with hope. Yet now, it felt like a pastry case filled with uncertainty. "Absolutely," he affirmed. As they parted ways later that evening, Sarah's heart was heavy with unshared concerns. She needed advice and support, something she knew her friends could offer in spades. The next morning found Sarah in the cozy confines of her bakery, surrounded by the familiar scents of cinnamon and sugar. Her friends gathered around a table laden with freshly baked scones and steaming mugs of coffee. "Okay, spill it," urged Danielle, her no-nonsense tone softened by the concern in her eyes. "You've been tossing us worried glances all morning." With a deep breath, Sarah let the facade crumble. "The bakery's in trouble." The words tumbled out, each one heavier than the last. "The bank sent another notice." I'm behind on loan payments, and if things don't pick up soon, I might have to close up shop. Murmurs of disbelief and sympathy buzzed around the table. Rachel reached over, squeezing Sarah's hand. We won't let that happen. You've worked too hard for this. Maybe we can organize some sort of fundraiser or event, suggested Natalie, her creative wheels turning, something to get people through the door and remind them how amazing this place is. Or a bake sale. We could put together an assortment of your best sellers, Rachel chimed in. Whenever I sell a house, I always give a gift to the family who purchased it. From this day forward, I'll include a basket of yummy sweets from your bakery. Thanks, guys. Sarah paused, the swell of emotions making her voice waver. I don't want to drag you all into my mess. Drag away, Lola said firmly, her statement echoed by the others' nods. We're not just here for the free coffee. We're a team. Speaking of which, there will be no more free coffee. We'll start paying like we should have been all alone. Lola dug into her purse and pulled out $100 bill. This is for all the free coffee I've consumed this year alone. I can't take that. Sarah protested. Please. It will make me feel better for mooching off my friend. Sarah sighed. All right. She took the money gratefully. Thank you. Danielle frowned. I don't carry that kind of cash, but if you'll take my debit card. No. You guys cannot just give me money to solve my problems. Do you have any idea how guilty I'd feel? It's not giving you money if I buy for my clients, is it? Rachel asked. We'll work on the fundraiser. We've got your back, Sarah. Always. Thank you, Sarah murmured, her heart swelling with gratitude. I could help you create a cookbook, Danielle said. And I could write a romance about a sweet bakery owner named Sarah who wrote a cookbook. Then when you publish the cookbook, I'll link to it in the back of my book. Trust me, when I describe the baked goods you make, everyone will want it. With their encouragement ringing in her ears, Sarah felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Maybe, just maybe, with a little help from her friends, there was a way to save her bakery after all. The bell above the bakery door jingled, signaling the arrival of Sarah's friends. The small group gathered around a rustic wooden table adorned with mismatched chairs that Sarah had lovingly restored herself. The scent of freshly baked pastries sweetened the air, wrapping them in an invisible blanket of comfort and familiarity. Okay, team, Sarah began, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of worries in her head. We need something big, something that'll bring the whole town down here. Right, like a Taste of Texas event. Natalie suggested, her eyes brightening. We could feature local ingredients, have taste tests, maybe even a pie-eating contest? I'm sure I could get the hospital to set up a booth screening blood pressure or something, so there's health involved as well. Love it. We make it an all-day shindig, Rachel said, tapping her pen against her notepad with enthusiasm. And what about live music? That always draws a crowd. Both brilliant ideas, Sarah exclaimed, the cogs turning as she envisioned the bakery transformed into a hive of activity and laughter. She stood up, pacing back and forth as the plan took shape. We could set up stands outside, too, get that street fair vibe going. Let's not forget social media, Danielle chimed in, holding up her phone. A few well-placed posts, and we could have people coming from counties over. I'll handle that if you'd like. But you'll have to add me as admin on all of your official bakery pages. I would happily do that. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face them. We'll call it Sweet on You Day, a day to fall in love with our bakery all over again. We'll offer discounts, introduce some new treats, and create an experience they won't forget. Sarah, that's perfect. Natalie clapped her hands together, her creative spark mirrored in her friend's determined gaze. All right, let's do this, Sarah declared, her heart swelling with renewed vigor. We'll need all hands on deck, but we can make this happen. This bakery is my dream, my passion, and I'm not giving up without a fight. Neither are we, Rachel said firmly, and the others nodded. They were all in to keep the bakery alive. Then it's settled, Sarah smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for these women who'd become her pillars. Sweet on You Day is happening, and it's going to be the turnaround we need. With laughter and chatter filling the cozy space, they dove into planning. Sarah knew the road ahead would be tough, but with her friends by her side, anything seemed possible. Sarah stood on tiptoe, stretching to loop a string of pastel bunting across the upper corner of the bakery's wide front window. The paper flags fluttered gently as if waving at passers-by to come and discover the sweet delights within. Behind her, Rachel buzzed around like a honeybee, adorning tables with vases of wildflowers while Natalie arranged a display of freshly baked sample treats near the entrance, their sweet aroma wafting enticingly into the air. "Sarah, these mini cupcakes are going to be a hit. I've already posted pictures on social media, and people are loving them," Danielle called out. "Great thinking. I'll put out some flyers around town later," Sarah replied. She stepped down from the ladder and surveyed the cheerful decor, her friends' laughter mingling with the scent of sugar and flour. It was perfect, well, almost. Flyers are good, but nothing beats face-to-face invites. "We'll split up Main Street and talk to everyone we see," Rachel suggested, wiping her hands on her apron before grabbing a stack of bright flyers. "Rachel's right. Besides, who could say no to your charming smile, Sarah?" Lola winked at her. "Charm might not be enough this time," Sarah murmured under her breath as she pretended to straighten a crooked flag. "Did you say something, hon?" Rachel glanced over, concern briefly knitting her brows together. "Nothing, just. Do you guys really think this will work?" Sarah hesitated, the words tumbling out in a rush of vulnerability. "I mean, what if Sweet on You Day isn't enough to get us back on track?" "Sarah Thompson, don't you start doubting now," Lola chided gently, crossing the room to take her friend's hands in hers. "You pour your heart into every pastry, every cake, you've got the whole town wrapped around your little finger." "Exactly," Rachel chimed in, coming to stand beside them, "and we're going to make sure everyone knows about it." "With your baking skills and our charm offensive? Honey, this place will be buzzing." Sarah laughed, the sound a little shaky but genuine. She looked at the faces of her friends, their confidence unshakable, their support unwavering. Her own doubts seemed to wilt under the warmth of their encouragement. "Okay, you're right. We've got this," Sarah said, bolstering her resolve. "Let's go spread the word and make Sweet on You Day the sweetest day this town has ever seen." With that, they each grabbed a handful of flyers and stepped out into the golden afternoon, ready to charm the community, one invitation at a time. Sweet on You Day had bloomed into life within the cozy walls of Sarah's bakery, every surface adorned with ribbons and fragrant bouquets that transformed the shop into a haven of cheer. The bell above the door jingled incessantly as a stream of customers flowed in, drawn by the promise of Sarah's renowned pastries and the infectious enthusiasm that seemed to radiate from within. "Sarah, you've outdone yourself with these cinnamon rolls," gushed a customer. "Thanks, Dottie," Sarah said. Her heart swelled at the sight of the bustling shop. "Hey, don't forget who rolled half of those," teased Natalie, nudging Sarah playfully with her elbow. "And who knew I'd be such a whiz with a cash register? Or me with the coffee machine?" Rachel added. "I swear, I'm getting barista vibes." Laughter bubbled up between them. Sarah glanced around, catching snippets of conversation as her friends mingled with customers, weaving tales of Sarah's dedication to her craft. "Look at this place, Sarah," Danielle said, sweeping an arm across the room where families and friends gathered. "Your dream, it's alive and kickin'. Kicking mightily," Sarah agreed, her earlier doubt dissolving in the face of their success. "Remember when you baked your first batch of cookies?" Rachel asked. "Who would have thought it'd lead to all this?" "Guess I've always been sweet on baking," Sarah said, the pun drawing a round of groans and chuckles from her friends. "Sweet on baking, and we're all sweet on you," Marie declared, raising a cupcake like a toast. "To Sarah, the heart and soul of this town's sweet tooth." "To Sarah," echoed the chorus of supportive voices, each one offering a silent prayer for the bakery's continued prosperity. As the day wore on, laughter and banter filled the air, creating a welcoming atmosphere. Sarah moved through the crowd, her presence a comforting constant as she ensured everyone felt at home. "Thank you, everyone, for coming out today," Sarah announced as the event wound down, her voice rich with gratitude. Your support means the world to me. Here's to many more days like this, Danielle called out, and a resounding murmur of agreement swept through the bakery. Here, here. Sarah replied, her gaze lingering on the empty plates and crumb-dusted trays. As the afternoon sun cast a warm glow on the bakery, Sarah weaved through the crowd, handing out slices of her signature peach cobbler. Her laughter mingled with the melodic chime of the door as new customers entered, drawn by the buzz of the event. Sarah, can you come here for a sec? Called Emily Lola, beckoning her from across the room with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Everything okay? Sarah asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she approached. Just watch, Lola replied with a grin. With a flourish, Lola and the rest of Sarah's friends cleared a space in the center of the bakery. The chatter hushed to a whisper before the opening chords of a familiar song filled the air, strummed on a guitar by Sarah's friend, Danielle. Sarah's friends began a flash mob dance, their movements synchronized to the beat, their joy infectious. Patrons pulled out their phones, capturing the moment as more onlookers pressed against the windows, lured by the unexpected performance. Sarah clapped her hands over her mouth, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears as the crowd clapped along. Y'all are crazy! Sarah exclaimed when the music came to an end and her friends took a bow. But her heart swelled with love for these people who had turned her bakery into a stage of support. Anything for you, Sarah, Danielle said, and the bakery erupted into another round of cheers. As the last notes faded away, the energy in the room didn't dwindle. Instead, it transformed into a bustling hive of activity, people ordering desserts, sharing stories, and promising to return. The cash register sang a steady melody as dollars exchanged hands. Looks like Sweet on You Day was a hit, Jake said, appearing beside her with 2 steaming cups of cocoa. More than just a hit, Sarah replied. We did it, Jake. We actually did it. Of course you did, he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You're Sarah Thompson. You're my girl. She laughed, the weight of worry now lifted. I couldn't have done it without my friends. Without this town. Without, she hesitated, meeting Jake's gaze, without you. Hey, we're in this together, Jake said, kissing the top of her head gently. Here's to fresh starts and second chances, Sarah toasted, raising her cocoa cup slightly. Here's to us, Jake agreed, clinking his cup against hers. The last of the stragglers waved goodbye, leaving a trail of laughter behind them as they exited the bakery. Sarah moved to the door, her hand still raised in farewell, the corners of her mouth sore from smiling so much. Sarah, everything okay? Jake's voice pulled her back into the now empty shop, where a few balloons still clung to the ceiling. Better than okay, she said, turning to him with eyes gleaming. We did it, Jake. We really did it. Knew you would. His grin matched hers. She moved closer to him, her apron dusted with flour, a badge of today's hard-wrought success. It wasn't just me. It was everyone. My friends, there. Amazing? Yeah, I saw the flash mob they pulled off. I haven't seen that many cowboy boots tapping in unison since the county fair line dance, he chuckled. Exactly, Sarah laughed, shaking her head at the memory. Their hearts are as big as Texas itself. Speaking of big hearts, Jake said, yours is the biggest I've come across. Your passion for this place, for baking, it's contagious. Today proved that. Her cheeks warmed under his gaze, and she squeezed his hands. I couldn't have faced this without you either. You've been my rock through all the late-night number crunching and recipe testing panic attacks. Hey, taste testing those panic attacks has been one of the perks of being around, he teased. What I'm trying to say is, I'm here for the long haul, Sarah. For every sugar high and every burnt batch of cookies. Good, she said, a softness in her tone, because I'm not planning on letting go of you anytime soon. Friends like these, a town that supports us, and, Sarah paused, and love that feels like coming home. I think we can handle whatever comes next. Whatever comes next, Jake echoed. Tomorrow, we start fresh, she murmured against his chest, but tonight, let's just enjoy this win. Agreed. He stepped back just enough to look at her, and maybe sneak in a celebratory cupcake or two? Or 3, Sarah replied with a wink. Chapter 7. Sarah wiped a flour-dusted hand across her forehead, her gaze going to Jake, who was hunched over his laptop at the corner table of her cozy bakery. A niggling feeling disturbed the warmth that usually filled her heart whenever she glanced at Jake. "Everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light as she approached him with a cupcake offering. It was his favorite, red velvet, with a swirl of cream cheese frosting. He snapped his laptop shut, a guarded look crossing his face. "Yeah, everything's great," he said, pasting on a smile. His phone buzzed on the tabletop, and he snatched it up, tilting the screen away from her view as he tapped out a response. "Who's texting?" Sarah ventured, her curiosity piqued by the evasive dance of his thumbs. "Work stuff," Jake replied curtly, slipping the phone into his pocket. Sarah's smile faltered, the red velvet cupcake forgotten in her hand. She had seen those little signs before, the hushed phone calls, the quickly closed tabs on his computer, and they were starting to paint an unsettling picture. Later that evening, Sarah found herself at Lola Sanchez's modern apartment, perched on a plush sofa, surrounded by her friends. Lola's energy filled the room as she paced back and forth, while Rachel sat with her nurturing presence, Danielle leaned forward with curious intensity, and Natalie massaged her tired feet after a long shift, her caring eyes watching Sarah intently. "Something's off," Sarah admitted, twisting her apron in her lap. "Jake's been so secretive lately." "I don't know, it just doesn't feel right." "Has he given you any reason not to trust him before?" Lola asked, her lawyer instincts kicking in. Rachel reached out to touch Sarah's arm soothingly. "Maybe he's planning a surprise for you, honey. Sometimes we read too much into things. Or maybe he's like one of my tragic characters, hiding a dark secret," Danielle mused, her writer's imagination taking flight. "Although, let's hope it's more mundane than my latest plot twist." "Guys, we all know Jake cares about Sarah," Natalie chimed in, practical as ever. "But if it's weighing on you this much, Sarah, you should talk to him, clear the air." The women exchanged knowing glances, each silently rooting for Sarah's happiness. And though their theories varied, their support was as steadfast as the Texas sun. "Thanks, y'all," Sarah said, a grateful smile tugging at her lips. "I guess I've got some thinking to do. It never occurred to me he could be hiding magical powers." As her friends rallied around her with words of encouragement and offers of assistance, Sarah felt the tight coil of worry in her chest loosen just a bit. Whatever was going on with Jake, she wasn't alone in facing it. Lola leaned forward, her dark eyes locking onto Sarah's. "Sarah, hon, you're not going to bake your way out of this one," she said, her voice a blend of compassion and no-nonsense practicality. "Look, I know it's scary," Lola continued, "but you need to talk to Jake face to face. Lay it all out there. You're amazing, and you deserve honesty. If something's up, better to tackle it head-on than let it fester." Sarah chewed on her bottom lip, considering Lola's advice. Lola was right, a direct conversation was the only way to get the answers she needed, even if the prospect made her insides twist. "Okay," Sarah exhaled, finding resolve in Lola's unwavering gaze. "I'll do it. I'll ask him to meet me at Beanie's Brew." The local coffee shop was neutral ground, cozy enough to feel intimate but public enough to keep the conversation from veering into uncomfortable territory. "Good for you, girl," Rachel exclaimed, while Danielle and Natalie nodded their encouragement. "Make sure you choose the table by the window," Danielle chimed in with a smile. "It has the best lighting for dramatic effect, in case things go south and you need to make a swift exit. Or for when everything goes well, and we see you two lovebirds making up," Natalie added optimistically. With a deep breath, Sarah pulled out her phone and began tapping out a message to Jake. "Hey, can we meet at Beanie's Brew tomorrow afternoon? There's something important we need to talk about." She hit send before doubt could claw its way back, and a sense of purpose steadied her shaking hands. Whether Jake was keeping secrets or simply being absent-minded, she'd find out soon enough. And until then, she had her friends to keep her company. Sarah pushed open the door to Beanie's Brew, a tinkling bell announcing her arrival. Her eyes swept over the familiar space, past the mismatched armchairs and the counter lined with an array of pastries, before landing on Jake. he was there, as promised, hunched over his phone. "Here goes nothing," she muttered under her breath, feeling the flutter of nerves in her stomach. She took a deep breath that did little to steady her heartbeat and made her way through the maze of tables, toward him. "Hey, Jake," Sarah said. Jake looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, she saw the flash of something unspoken flit across his face. "Sarah, hey. I wasn't sure you'd make it," he said, slipping his phone into his pocket and standing to greet her with a smile. "Of course, I'd make it," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. She slid into the chair opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We need to talk." "Sounds serious," Jake said, leaning back. "What's up?" Sarah took another fortifying breath. "It's about us," she began, her voice soft but firm. "Lately, I've been feeling like there's this distance between us. You're always on your phone or your computer, and when I ask about it, you brush it off." Jake's brows furrowed, and he shifted in his seat. "Sarah, Please, let me finish," she interrupted, her empathetic nature taking a back seat to the need for honesty. "I care about you, Jake, a lot. But this secretive behavior, it's making me question our foundation. Trust is everything to me, and right now, I feel like I'm grasping at straws trying to hold on to it." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah watched Jake closely, looking for some sign, some clue that would tell her that this man, the most eligible bachelor in town who had somehow chosen her, was still the man she thought she knew. Jake's posture stiffened as Sarah's words filled the space around them, a barrier rising in his expression, a mix of armor and reflex. His hands gripped the edge of the table as if physically holding on to his side of the story. "Look, I get that you're concerned," Jake said, a touch of frustration lacing his voice, "but you've got to understand, it's not about you." "Then help me understand because it feels like you're pushing me away," Sarah countered, her eyes never leaving his. Her heart was racing, but she held her ground. "Pushing you away?" he echoed, almost incredulously. "Yes, Jake. When you hide things, when you dodge my questions, it feels like there's this whole side of you that I don't even know." The tremor in her voice was subtle, but there. He let out a long breath, the fight going out of him as he took in her open, hopeful face. Something shifted in those piercing blue eyes, a softening around the edges that Sarah hadn't seen before. "All right," he conceded, his tone yielding to the gravity of the moment. He set his phone down, face up on the table. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" Sarah asked gently, her curiosity piqued, but her demeanor still patient. "Back in college, I had this relationship," Jake started, his gaze dropping to his untouched coffee cup. "It was everything to me, or so I thought. Turned out she was using me to get back at her ex. She played me like a fiddle, and when I found out," he paused, swallowing hard. "Let's just say it left scars. Ones that make it hard for me to not keep a few secrets, even from people I care about. Like armor, you know?" A wave of sympathy washed over Sarah as she listened, her own past experiences with heartache resonating with his confession. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a window into why Jake had been keeping parts of himself under lock and key. "Jake," she said softly, reaching across the table to tentatively cover his hand with her own, "I'm not her. I'm not going to hurt you like that. But we have to be honest with each other, or we'll never work." He looked up then, meeting her gaze fully for what felt like the first time in weeks. "I know that now. And I'm sorry for making you feel like you couldn't trust me. I want to fix this." Her smile was cautious but genuine as she gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll fix it together. That's what trust is all about, right?" "Right," he agreed. "Back in Dallas," Jake began, voice barely above a whisper, "I was engaged once." He chuckled ruefully, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Turns out she was more in love with my bank account than with me." Sarah leaned in, her worries momentarily forgotten as she absorbed the pain lacing his words. A jolt of empathy shot through her. It wasn't just the bakery that demanded all her hours, it was the understanding of damaged trust. "Every time I thought I could let someone in again, it felt like I was setting myself up for another fall," Jake admitted, his gaze finally meeting hers. Jake, I get it, Sarah said, her heart aching for him. But we're not our pasts. We get to create our futures. Thank you, Sarah. It was the first time she'd seen Jake look relieved. Outside, pressed against the glass, Lola's face appeared, her expression taut with concern. Beside her, Rachel, Danielle, and Natalie huddled close, trying to catch a glimpse of the couple who seemed worlds away from the coffee shop's casual chatter. They watched, holding their collective breath, as Jake reached for Sarah's hands across the table, holding them tightly as if they were the lifeline anchoring him to a new beginning. Inside, Sarah felt something shift. Here was Jake, laying bare his scars, and here she was, willing to show hers. It was messy, complicated, and undeniably human. It was real. Let's promise each other something, Sarah whispered, her voice steady, despite the tremor she felt. No more secrets, okay? No more armor. Just us, figuring this thing. Deal, Jake said. Unseen by the couple, their audience outside exchanged silent looks of relief. Lola's eyes softened, and she stepped back from the window, gesturing for the others to join her. They took the cue, retreating from the scene with quiet respect for the private moment. Lola led the pack, her heels clicking on the pavement with a rhythm that matched her resolve. Come on, let's give them a little sunshine, she beckoned over her shoulder. Sunshine and rainbows, right behind you, Rachel chimed in. Danielle and Natalie fell in step beside them, Danielle's pen tucked behind her ear, a sword sheathed for a happier battle. Natalie's smile was weary but genuine. The door chimed as they entered the coffee shop, its cozy din muffling their approach. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with surprise before melting into gratitude as Jake twisted in his chair to face the newcomers. Hey, what's this? The cavalry? Jake joked, his tone light. More like your cheerleading squad, Lola retorted, nudging Sarah's elbow with an arm. We came to remind you that you've got something special here. Sarah, seeing you happy is like hitting the jackpot, and we'll bet on you two any day, Rachel added, reaching out to squeeze Sarah's hand. Your story could fuel a dozen novels, Danielle mused. And I mean the good kind, with all the messy bits that make love worth it. Natalie leaned against the counter, her gaze soft yet fervent. Taking care of each other, that's the real deal. You've both got big hearts, don't forget to save some of that care for yourselves. Absolutely, Jake agreed. And we'll make sure we have fun along the way. Chapter 8. Very early in the morning on the following Saturday, Sarah found herself bustling around her bakery, the sweet aroma of fresh pastries mingling with the scent of strong coffee. Today was not just any Saturday, it was the day Jake had invited her to escape to San Antonio with him. She moved with purpose, a checklist running through her mind, ensuring that every little thing was in place for Danielle to take the helm. Danishes are done, and the croissants are almost ready, Sarah said, sliding a tray of golden, flaky pastries from the oven. Sarah, you're like a whirlwind this morning, Danielle commented with an amused smile. This place will be standing when you get back, you know. Can't help it, Sarah said. I just want everything perfect, so I don't worry while I'm gone. Danielle's eyes sparkled with a mix of excitement and mischief. I'm glad Jake's finally whisking you away for a romantic getaway. Me too. Sarah responded. He asked me to spend the weekend with him in San Antonio. I'm really excited. All of our dates seem to have to be worked around how much we both work. I know you're going to have a wonderful time, Danielle told her, clapping her hands together. And don't you fret about the bakery. Remember the fundraiser? I rocked that cash register like a pro. It'll be a piece of cake. Thanks, Danny. I owe you one, Sarah said as she dusted flour off her hands. She trusted Danielle, they'd been through thick and thin together, after all. Go, have fun, fall in love, Danielle urged. San Antonio is the perfect backdrop for romance. All right, I'm going, Sarah laughed. She was ready to find what she'd always dreamed of, love and happiness, and perhaps with Jake, it was closer than she ever imagined. With a final glance at her cozy bakery, Sarah stepped out into the cool morning air, her steps light and hopeful. San Antonio awaited, and who knew, maybe more than just a cityscape would steal her heart this weekend. The steady rhythm of the road lulled Sarah into a gentle slumber, her breath sinking with the soft hum of Jake's truck as it ate up the miles to San Antonio. She was curled up in the passenger seat, a lightweight blanket draped over her, a gift from Jake, who had noticed her shiver as they left the slightly chill dawn of their small Texas town behind. Jake glanced at her occasionally, his eyes taking in the peaceful expression on her face and the way her auburn hair fanned out against the headrest. There was something about the calmness that surrounded her as she slept that made his heart thrum with a peculiar warmth. He took care to navigate smoothly around bends and over bumps, unwilling to disturb her restful state. Finally, the urban skyline began to sketch itself against the horizon, and he knew they were close. Pulling into the hotel parking lot, he parked and turned off the engine before turning to Sarah. His hand hesitated, then gently brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead. "Sarah," he said softly, "we're here." She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open, still clouded with sleep. "Already?" Sarah stretched, her movements languid, like a cat basking in a sunbeam. "Yup, 2 hours on the dot." Jake flashed a reassuring smile. "I hope the ride wasn't too rough." "It was perfect. I haven't slept this well in ages," she replied, her voice warm with gratitude. As she gathered the blanket and her purse, Jake grabbed their bags from the back. They walked into the hotel lobby together, and the cool blast of air conditioning was a stark contrast to the growing heat outside. The sound of their boots against the polished marble floors gave an oddly satisfying click with each step. "Hope you don't mind," Jake began, scratching the back of his neck as they waited for the elevator. "I only booked one room. With 2 beds." His gaze flickered to hers, gauging her reaction. "I thought, maybe we could spend more time together, but I didn't want to presume." "Jake," Sarah interrupted, placing a hand on his arm and giving it a gentle squeeze. Her smile was tender, tinged with a hint of mischief. "It's okay. Really. I appreciate the thoughtfulness. 2 beds are perfect." His relief was palpable, and the corners of his eyes crinkled with the sincerity of his smile. "Great. I just wanted this weekend to be special for us, no pressure." Special echoed in Sarah's thoughts as the elevator doors opened with a soft ding. Whatever the weekend held, it was clear it would be a time she'd cherish. As they stepped out onto their floor, Sarah felt a bubbling excitement. This was it, the start of their San Antonio adventure. And whether they returned with just fond memories or something deeper, she was glad to be stepping into the story with Jake by her side. Laughter bubbled up around them as Jake led Sarah through the cozy ambience of a dimly lit restaurant on the San Antonio River Walk, their hands brushing with a hint of nervous electricity. The aroma of spices and seared meats filled the air, promising a feast for the senses, and each table seemed to be a little island of candlelight romance. He guided her to a secluded corner, pulling out her chair with a practiced charm that made her heart skip. As they settled into the quiet hush of their private space, a waiter appeared, uncorking a bottle of wine with a flourish that matched the sparkle in Jake's eyes. "Here's to new adventures," Jake toasted, lifting his glass toward Sarah with a smile that reached deep into his piercing blue eyes. "New adventures," Sarah said as she sipped the rich, red wine. They dived into a meal that was both sumptuous and surprisingly comfortable, with each bite seeming to draw them closer. Jake's fingers fidgeted with his napkin before he set it aside with a decisive motion. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice dropping to a confessional whisper. "Something nobody back in Butterfly knows about me." She leaned forward, drawn in by the sudden earnestness in his tone. "You can tell me anything, Jake." He took a deep breath, his sandy blonde hair falling across his forehead as he looked down, then back up at her. "I've been writing for years. Not just any writing, horror. And it's done well, more than well." "Horror?" Sarah blinked, taken aback but intrigued by this unexpected facet of the man she thought she knew. "Yep." A rueful grin touched his lips. "The kind that gives you chills and keeps you up at night. It's been my secret outlet, my other life. When you asked who I was texting with, it was my publisher. I have another book coming out next week." "Wow, I would have never guessed that." "Thing is," Jake continued, All the money from my books, it's not enough. My father's ranch has been sinking, and I poured everything into keeping it afloat. Sarah reached across the table, covering his hand with her own. That must be so hard for you. Jake's hand turned under hers, squeezing gently. It is. But I have an idea, a way to save it and keep the family legacy alive. I'm thinking of converting it into a dude ranch. Letting folks stay in cabins, experience ranch life. Jake, that sounds amazing. Her eyes shone with excitement and admiration. You'd be sharing a piece of who you are with others. Your passion could give the ranch new life. Exactly, he said. I want to create a place where stories unfold, where people can make memories. But I don't want to give up my writing. I can hire a manager to run the dude ranch and keep my day job. That sounds smart, she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. Do you think a dude ranch could make enough that you won't have to constantly worry about keeping the ranch afloat? I do, he said, lifting her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. The Riverwalk's waters lapped gently against the hull of the boat as it wound through the heart of San Antonio, a ribbon of serenity amidst the buzz of the city. Sarah leaned over the side, her eyes reflecting the twinkle of lights strung above them. Jake watched her, his heart doing an odd little skip whenever she laughed at the guide's well-rehearsed jokes. Did you know this place is almost a century old? Jake said, nudging her playfully as they passed under a bridge, the shadows playing on their faces. Really? Sarah's voice was filled with genuine interest, her bakery worries left far behind in Butterfly. It's like we're floating through history. Exactly, Jake agreed, pointing to a building that had stood witness to changes both past and present. Every corner here has a story. As they soaked in tales of Texan valor and romance that made up the Riverwalk's lore, Sarah's hand found its way into Jake's, their fingers intertwining naturally. The connection felt as easy as the river's flow, and just as inevitable. Thank you for bringing me here, Sarah whispered, squeezing his hand. Thank you for coming, Jake replied. Eventually, the boat docked, and they disembarked and returned to the hotel. Inside their room, Sarah hesitated for a heartbeat before speaking up. Give me a moment, will you? I want to change into something more comfortable. Of course, Jake nodded, a curious glint in his eye as he watched her slip into the bathroom with a small bag. He flopped onto one of the beds, hands folded behind his head, trying not to let his thoughts run wild. Sarah was full of surprises, and he could only imagine what she had planned. After a while, the bathroom door creaked open. Jake sat up, anticipation tightening his chest. There she stood, framed in the doorway, her hair cascading over the delicate straps of the pink negligee that clung to her curves. He caught the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, before she masked it with a brave smile. Wow, Sarah, his words trailed off, leaving unspoken the depth of his admiration. Is it too much? Her voice wavered slightly, betraying her nerves. Absolutely not. He rose from the bed, his movements slow, deliberate, as if not to startle a skittish fawn. You look breathtaking. She exhaled a laugh that didn't quite hide her relief, the pink fabric fluttering with every breath. It suited her. Thanks, Jake. That means a lot. Her gaze met his, warmth spreading between them, a silent acknowledgement of the step they were about to take. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she took a tentative step into the room, the pink fabric of her negligee whispering against her skin. For a moment, she felt utterly exposed under Jake's gaze, but then his eyes softened, and the corners of his mouth lifted in an appreciative smile. Sarah, you're stunning, he said, his voice low and husky. His eyes seemed to darken with sincerity. You're curvy in all the right places. Her nervousness melted under the heat of his compliment. She crossed the short distance between them, the carpet muting her steps. Jake remained still, allowing her to close the gap, an open invitation written in his relaxed stance. Thank you, Jake, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. And with courage bolstered by the look of pure admiration in his eyes, she wrapped her arms around him. His body was a contrast to the softness of her own. Her lips found his in a kiss that started gentle, a question asked and answered without words. Jake responded with equal measure, his hands resting lightly on her waist, anchoring her to the moment, to him, to the thrill of what was unfolding between them. The kiss deepened, their breaths mingling, hearts drumming a shared rhythm. And as they pulled away just enough to see the promise in each other's eyes, it seemed that every doubt and fear had been kissed away, leaving only the bright hope of what was yet to come. The fervor of their kisses grew. Jake's hands moved with deliberate care, fingers brushing the delicate fabric of Sarah's negligee, tracing the contours of her body as if committing every curve to memory. Her breath hitched in her throat when his touch skated down her back, deftly unfastening the clasp that held the garment together. "Jake," she whispered against his lips, I'm. Her voice was a fragile wisp of sound, nearly lost in the space between them. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, offering a tender smile. "It's okay, Sarah," he assured her. "We'll take our time." But there was something about Jake, the way he looked at her, the patient tenderness in his touch, that told her she could trust him. With a nod, she allowed herself to lean into that trust, surrendering to the moment and him. Together, they embarked on a dance as old as time, a gentle shedding of barriers that left them standing bare before each other. His shirt followed her negligee. The moonlight filtering through the window bathed them in a silver glow, casting a spell over the room that felt both intimate and infinite. Sarah's heart raced as they made their way to the bed, the world outside their cocoon fading to non-existence. There, Jake's exploration became more earnest, his hands charting a path over her skin that seared her with exquisite anticipation. His mouth followed the trail blazed by his hands, soft and warm, igniting a cascade of shivers that rippled across her flesh. Her nerves danced under his ministrations, raw and electric, yet beneath it all was the growing certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, here, with Jake, in the tender search for shared happiness and the promise of love's sweet fulfillment. With a quivering breath, Sarah's world narrowed to the rhythm of Jake's heartbeat against her own. The soft hotel sheets were a whisper across their intertwined limbs as they moved together in a tentative yet determined ballet of passion and discovery. His eyes, deep pools of blue, never left hers, anchoring her to the present. "Are you okay?" Jake whispered, his voice like a velvet caress against her heightened senses. "More than okay," she managed to reply, her voice a tremulous thread of sound. She felt him smile against her skin, his lips tracing a path of fire that made her arch in response. Each moment was a discovery. With every tender movement, Jake banished her nerves. And then, as the crescendo of shared connection drew them closer to the edge of a precipice she hadn't dared to dream of before, they leapt. Together they soared, wrapped in the euphoria of newfound unity, until the world itself seemed to dissolve into a tapestry of warmth and light and whispered endearments. Sarah nestled into Jake's embrace. His arms, strong yet gentle, were a fortress around her. His breath, steady now, brushed over her hair, a soothing lullaby that coaxed her toward sleep. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyelids heavy with the weight of emotions and the physical toll of their lovemaking. "For what?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement and wonder. "For this," she said, her words slurred by the onset of sleep, "for being you." A chuckle rumbled through his chest, vibrating against her back where she lay curled against him. "I should be thanking you, Sarah. You've given me more than you know." As she drifted off, cocooned in the warmth of his embrace, Jake watched her, the rise and fall of her breathing a comforting cadence. He was awestruck by the trust she placed in him, by the vulnerability and strength she possessed in equal measure. He was thankful, oh so thankful, for Sarah Thompson, the woman who had walked into his life and illuminated it with the possibility of love, the promise of tomorrow. And as sleep claimed him too, he surrendered to the dreams of a future where she was his partner, his home. Chapter 9. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, casting a warm golden haze over the room. Sarah stirred, her mind surfacing from the depths of a peaceful slumber. At first, she felt disoriented, the unfamiliarity of her surroundings coaxing a flutter of confusion in her chest. Then, as awareness crept in, she recognized the steady rhythm of a heartbeat under her ear and the strong arm wrapped protectively around her waist. Jake's arm. The scent of him, sandalwood and something uniquely Jake, comforted her, grounding her back to the delightful reality of their situation. She snuggled closer, feeling his chest rise and fall with each breath. His presence was a balm to the frenetic pace of her everyday life, soothing away the worries that often knitted her brows together. "Morning, sunshine," Jake murmured, his voice gravelly with sleep. A contented smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as his eyes opened to meet hers. "Morning," Sarah replied, her voice a soft whisper. The corners of her lips curved upwards as she shifted to face him, taking in the tousled sandy hair that flopped over his forehead endearingly. For a moment, they simply gazed at each other. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, they leaned in simultaneously. Their lips met in a tender kiss. Pulling back just enough to speak, Jake's eyes twinkled with mischief. "How about we order some room service to start the day? I'm thinking pancakes, bacon, and maybe some fresh strawberries on the side. What do you say?" Sarah laughed, the sound light and carefree. "That sounds perfect. But won't that make us late for whatever mysterious plans you have today?" Her curiosity piqued, eager to know what he had up his sleeve. "Ah, but I haven't told you the best part." He propped himself up on one elbow. "I thought we could spend the entire day at SeaWorld. Just you, me, and a bunch of marine life." "SeaWorld," she echoed, her eyes widening in surprise and delight. The idea of spending a day filled with laughter and discovery sent a thrill through her. "You really know how to plan a date, don't you?" "Only the best for my girl," he said, his tone playful yet sincere. The smile that spread across Sarah's face was radiant, reflecting the joy bubbling up inside her. "Let's do it," she agreed, her heart skipping a beat at the prospect of a whole day with Jake, a day to forge new memories and perhaps deepen the connection that had been steadily building between them. With a quick peck on his cheek, she reached for the phone to order breakfast. It was after dark when Sarah and Jake finally made their way to the parking lot, the distant echo of SeaWorld's closing announcements fading behind them. Sarah's legs felt like they were filled with lead, each step an effort as she leaned heavily against Jake. The exhilaration from the day's adventures had given way to a bone-deep weariness, her thoughts drifting to the mound of baking that awaited her tonight. "Jake," she said, "how am I going to manage all the baking in the morning? I can barely keep my eyes open." He glanced down at her with a gentle smile, his arm wrapping more securely around her shoulders. "You won't have to. Just sleep on the ride back, and let me take care of the rest," he murmured as they reached his truck. She blinked up at him, confused. "But the bakery?" "I'll meet you there at 4 a.m., he assured her as he helped her into the passenger seat, tucking her in like she was precious cargo. "I'll help you set up for the day. It's the least I can do after kidnapping you for a weekend of fun." "Thank you, Jake, really." "But you don't have to do this," she protested weakly. Jake shut the door and walked around to the driver's side, a chuckle escaping him. "Oh, but I do. How else am I going to convince you to go off with me again?" he teased, winking at her before he started the engine. Sarah couldn't help the tired giggle that bubbled out of her. His presence made it easier to close her eyes and surrender to the exhaustion. As the vehicle hummed along the darkened roads leading back to town, she drifted off, comforted by the thought of his promise to join her in the early morning hours. Her last conscious thought was a hopeful flutter in her chest, wondering what other surprises Jake had in store. Sarah leaned against the doorframe of her house, her body humming with a blend of fatigue and contentment. Jake's silhouette loomed in front of her, grinning. "All right, then," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and tinged with humor. "I reckon it's time for you to get some shut-eye, darlin'. Only if you promise to actually show up at 4 a.m., she teased back, trying to sound stern but failing miserably as her lips twitched into a smile. "Cross my heart," Jake replied, his hand lifting to trace an X over his chest before he dipped his head, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. Sarah's heart fluttered like a trapped butterfly. She reached up, her fingers brushing against the stubble on his jaw, anchoring herself to this moment. Their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat, everything else melted away. Then he pressed his lips to hers, a promise sealed in the sweetest of gestures. "Good night, Sarah," he murmured against her lips, pulling back just enough to gaze into her eyes, something that made her belly flip. "Good night, Jake," she said, watching his retreating form was every bit as pleasing as his approach had been. As the sound of his truck faded into the night, Sarah stepped inside, her mind replaying the kiss. She shrugged off her jacket and kicked off her shoes, moving through the motions as if in a dream. With each step toward her bedroom, she felt the weight of the day's adventures press down on her, a pleasant heaviness that promised deep slumber. She set the alarm on her phone, the glaring digits proclaiming 3:30 a.m. far sooner than she'd like, but the thought of Jake being there, ready to dive into her world, made it seem less daunting. She slipped beneath the cool sheets, her body sinking into the mattress. Tomorrow, she whispered to the quiet room, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The bakery would be a flurry of activity, but with Jake by her side, she felt as though they could conquer mountains of pastries together. The chime above the bakery door tinkled just as Sarah flicked on the lights, heralding Jake's timely arrival. Through bleary eyes still fighting the grip of sleep, she saw him, leaning casually against the counter, with hands buried in his jean pockets. His hair looked like it had been tousled by more than just the morning breeze. "Morning," he greeted with a grin that could have powered the espresso machine. "Goodness, you're punctual," Sarah chuckled, tying her apron strings behind her back. "Wouldn't miss it," Jake replied, though his gaze darted warily to the mixers lined up like soldiers ready for battle. "First things first," she said, passing him a clean apron, which he unfolded with exaggerated care. The fabric met his nose, and he crinkled it with an expression somewhere between amusement and mild despair. "You'll get used to the smell of flour. Is that what that is?" He feigned innocence as he tied the apron around his waist, looking every bit the fish out of water, or rather, the rancher in a bakery. "Get your hands washed, and I'll assign your first task." "Ah, you're making me wash my hands? That sounds like a lot of work." She shook her head. "All right, partner. Let's start with the basics." Sarah handed him a tray of pastries to arrange in the display case. He approached the task with a furrowed brow, placing each pastry with the precision of a jeweler setting diamonds. She couldn't help but smile at his determination, even when he double-checked if the croissants were smiling wide enough for the customers. Side by side, they worked through the prep list, Sarah whipping up batter while Jake tackled a mountain of dough with a rolling pin like it was a personal challenge. "Never thought I'd see Jake Williams elbow-deep in cookie dough," she teased, sprinkling flour over the countertop. "Sarah's bakery has a new apprentice baker." "Who would have guessed?" he responded. As they moved in their early morning dance, the bakery came alive with the scent of rising bread and cinnamon, a symphony of timers and blenders scoring their movements. The tasks were mundane, but with Jake, even the simplest things felt laced with an undercurrent of excitement, a promise of something more. When the clock signaled the rush of opening hours, Sarah glanced over at Jake, who was now inspecting a batch of scones as if they held the secrets of the universe. She tiptoed closer and reached up to plant a grateful kiss on his cheek. "Thanks for all your help, Jake. You can head off now. I've got it from here," she said, expecting him to be eager to escape the floury chaos. He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving white handprints like badges of honor, and shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere. Thought I'd stick around, maybe learn a thing or two about scones and such." "Really?" Her eyebrows arched in surprise, warmth blooming in her chest at the unexpected offer. "Really," he confirmed with a nod so decisive it left no room for argument. Then, "Welcome to the team, Baker Jake." Or would that be Baker Jaker? "I do like things to rhyme," she said as the front door chimed announcing the first customer stepping into the cozy embrace of the bakery. Sarah slid a fresh tray of blueberry muffins into the display case, her movements rhythmic and practiced. The bell above the door jingled merrily as customers came and went, each greeted by the homely scent of baked goods and Sarah's warm smile. She tried to focus on decorating a batch of cupcakes, piping rosettes with a steady hand. But the flutter in her stomach wasn't from the sugar rush, it was Jake's steadfast attention, making her heart thrum with a blend of nerves and excitement. "Hey, Sarah." The familiar voice made her skin crawl, and she nearly squeezed the pastry bag hard enough to burst it. She turned to find Mark leaning on the counter, his grin as cocky as ever. "Mark," she said, aiming for casual, but the word came out tight. "What are you doing here? Can't I visit my favorite baker?" He leaned closer, dropping his voice. "I've been thinkin', we were good together, weren't we?" What do you say about giving it another shot? Her heart sank. Of all the days, why today? Her eyes flicked toward Jake, who had abandoned his feigned interest in the laptop. He was standing now, the lines of his jaw set firm. Mark, that's a terrible idea, Sarah stammered, searching for polite rejection, but Mark's persistence was legendary, and politeness didn't seem to register in his twisted brain. You know I'm dating Jake now. Come on, Sarah, you know you haven't found anyone who can. His attempt at charm was cut short when Jake stepped up beside them, his height casting a shadow over Mark's smugness. Mark, she said no, Jake wasn't happy. It's time you respect that and leave her alone. Mark sized up Jake, a sneer replacing his smile. And what? You're her knight now? Let's talk outside, Jake suggested, or rather insisted, with a tilt of his head toward the door. Sarah's hands twisted the fabric of her apron, watching through the window as the two men faced off. Their voices were lost amidst the din of passing cars and the occasional shout from across the street, but their postures spoke volumes. Jake, protective, Mark, all wounded pride. A timer dinged, a reminder that life, and baking, waited for no drama. Sarah exhaled slowly, trying to shake off her mortification. She refocused on her cupcakes, the vibrant swirls of frosting becoming her mantra of calm. Jake might be arguing on her behalf right now, but her bakery was her sanctuary, her independence, and no man, past or present, would ever take that from her. The bell above the bakery door jangled its farewell as the last customer of the day departed, leaving Sarah to flip the sign to closed with a weary sigh. She glanced over at Jake, who had returned to his corner. He was typing away, but the set of his jaw and the rigid line of his shoulders spoke volumes. Jake was angry, and Sarah knew it was more than just the clatter of keys that punctuated the silence between them. Jake, she asked. Is everything okay? He didn't look up, his fingers pausing briefly before resuming their staccato dance. Fine, he muttered. She watched him for a moment longer, torn between the urge to probe and the wisdom to let it be. In the end, she busied herself with shutting down the ovens. Later, as they walked side by side, Jake's presence was a silent force next to her. The familiar route to her home felt different tonight, every step heavy with unspoken questions. When her front porch came into view, she turned to him, her eyes searching his profile for some clue to what he was thinking. Jake, we don't have to talk about. Sarah, he cut in, do you still have any feelings for Mark? His question astonished her. He had to know she had real feelings for him, or she wouldn't have let him. Mark? Surprise etched her features. No, Jake. Absolutely not. Are you sure? Because if there's even a sliver of doubt. None, she insisted, stepping closer and placing a hand on his arm, feeling the muscle tense beneath her touch. What happened with Mark, it's all in the past. He nodded, though the tension didn't quite dissipate. Still, there was a softening around his eyes, a reluctant acceptance that perhaps he wanted to believe her more than he was willing to admit out loud. Okay, he said simply. Okay, she echoed, smiling up at him despite the flutter of unease in her stomach. Do you want to stay for supper? I can whip something up super quick. All right. If you're sure you don't mind. Cooking for two is just as easy as cooking for one. Unless it's grilled cheese. Then you have to stand longer as you butter the bread and all. Are you making grilled cheese? No, her grin made him laugh. In her tiny kitchen, Sarah moved with a mechanical rhythm, boiling pasta and simmering sauce. Jake sat at the small table, staring into the distance, his body there but his mind miles away. She glanced at him as she chopped basil, her fingers itching to toss the knife aside and demand he share whatever was eating at him. Can I help with anything? Jake finally offered. No, it's almost ready, Sarah replied. All she could think about was how satisfying it would be to give Mark a piece of her mind for stirring up trouble. Dinner was served in silence, punctuated only by the clink of cutlery against the plates. Sarah observed Jake pushing his food around more than eating it, the furrow between his brows deepening with every passing second. Are you thinking about Mark? Jake's question sliced through the quiet like a sharp blade. Sarah paused, a half-eaten forkful of spaghetti hovering before her. She set the fork down gently, her appetite vanishing. I can't stop thinking about what he said today. How dare he just walk back into my life like that? Jake pushed his plate away, his jaw set hard. So, you're thinking about him, only about how angry I am. Sarah protested, the words tumbling out in a rush, desperate for him to understand. But Jake stood, his chair scraping back abruptly. I think I should go, he said, the hurt unmistakable. Wait, please, let me explain. Sarah reached for him, but he sidestepped her touch. Good night, Sarah. The finality in his voice made her flinch. She watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. Alone amidst the remnants of uneaten dinner, Sarah slumped into her chair. The house felt silent without Jake's laughter filling it. Damn you, Mark, she whispered, a single tear trailing down her cheek. Chapter 10. The neon sign of the Rusty Spur flickered like a beacon as Sarah pushed through the wooden doors, her friends in tow. The cozy bar, with its well-worn stools and the scent of spiced peanuts lingering in the air, was buzzing with the chatter of locals unwinding after another long day. First round of Cokes on me, ladies, Sarah declared. Lola, with her lawyerly poise, flashed a grin, while Rachel, ever the nurturing mother hen, made sure they had enough seats. Danielle nodded absently, likely crafting her latest romantic tale in her head. Natalie sighed in relief at the sight of an empty chair. Sarah scanned the room, her eyes settling on Jake leaning casually against the bar. His hair was tousled just right, and his eyes seemed to sparkle even in the dim light. He held a magnetic charm that could make any heart skip a beat, especially Sarah's. Isn't he something? Danielle murmured, following Sarah's gaze. Who? Jake? Sarah played it cool, taking a sip of her drink. He's all right, I guess. All right? Natalie chuckled. You're about as subtle as a bull in a china shop, Sarah. Just then, Sarah's heart hitched. Across the room, Jake had started talking to someone new, a familiar figure that made her stomach twist into knots. Mark stood there talking with Jake like they were old college buddies. Is that? Rachel began, but Sarah was already nodding, her brow furrowed. Yep. What on earth could they be talking about? Sarah's voice trailed off, curiosity piqued. She tried to focus on Lola's story about her latest courtroom victory, but her attention kept drifting to the private exchange happening across the bar. Maybe they're just catching up? Natalie offered, always the voice of reason. Or maybe they're plotting to buy out my bakery and turn it into a gym, Sarah said. Her friends laughed, unaware of the gears turning in Sarah's mind. Come on, Sarah, Lola said with a roll of her eyes. You've got the best cupcakes in Texas. No man in his right mind would mess with that. True, Sarah conceded, but her gaze remained locked on Jake and her ex, the murmur of their conversation tantalizingly out of reach. Hey, Rachel nudged her gently. Whatever it is, we've got your back, okay? Sarah managed a smile, bolstered by her friend's support, yet, as Jake threw his head back in laughter at something her ex said, a bubble of worry lodged itself in her chest. Could her judgment be trusted when it came to any man? Let's dance, Danielle suggested. Before you spy any more conspiracies. Good idea, Sarah agreed, but as she stood and followed the girls to the makeshift dance floor, her mind stayed behind, watching Jake and wondering why he would even look at Mark without throwing a punch. Sarah excused herself from the twirling bodies and thumping bass of the dance floor with a mumbled need for the restroom. She wound her way through the crowd, each step bringing her closer to the corner booth where Jake and her ex huddled over drinks. Dropping her gaze to feign disinterest, she edged nearer under the pretense of searching for a friend. The plan, she caught Jake's voice, laced with a seriousness that seemed out of place in the loud establishment. She hovered by a nearby table, pretending to check her phone while straining to listen. The words were muffled, distorted by the cacophony of bar noise, but another fragment floated toward her. Sarah's bakery. A cold shiver raced down Sarah's spine. Why would they be talking about her bakery? Her grip tightened around the phone, knuckles blanching. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. No, it didn't make sense. But as she stood there, invisible in the sea of revelers, the snippets swirled in her head, piecing together an ominous puzzle. Are you okay? A concerned voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Sarah jolted, looking up into the face of a bar patron she'd unwittingly been using as cover. I'm fine, she stammered, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace, just waiting for a friend. Sure, the woman nodded, though her eyes lingered with polite skepticism. Retreating before her eavesdropping became too obvious, Sarah found herself adrift among the laughter and conversation, her mind racing. Was there truth to her fears, or was she reading betrayal in the benign? The doubt was a bitter pill, and trust, a fragile thing, felt as if it were slipping through her fingers. Sarah sidestepped through the crowd with the grace of a woman who had spent her life avoiding kitchen spills and mishaps, but every step felt heavy, weighed down by the dread coiling in her stomach. Girl, what's wrong? You look like you just saw a ghost. Danielle's voice cut through the fog of Sarah's thoughts. Or worse, Rachel chimed in, a health inspector in your bakery. Nothing, Sarah lied, forcing another brittle smile. Her eyes flicked back to Jake and her ex, still deep in hushed conversation. The word plan reverberated in her mind, a drumbeat of impending doom. Come on, Sarah. It's me, Lola. Spill it, Lola urged, slipping an arm around Sarah's trembling shoulders. You're paler than a man with a week left on death row. I'm fine, really, Sarah insisted, even as her heart sprinted and doubt gnawed at her insides. Does this have to do with Jake? Lola's perceptive gaze followed Sarah's line of sight. Are they planning something? Danielle asked. Plan? Jake's laughter reached them, a jovial sound that once made Sarah's world brighter but now seemed shrouded in mystery. Guys, I think I need some air, Sarah said abruptly. Her legs moved of their own accord, propelling her toward the exit. Sarah, wait. Rachel called out, but the noise swallowed her words. Let her go. Give her a minute, Danielle suggested. Sarah charged back into the bar, her curls bouncing with every furious step. The laughter and chatter became a distant hum as she zeroed in on Jake, who stood with his back to her, still deep in conversation with her ex Jake. Her voice sliced through the noise, sharp enough to cut the tension that hung thick in the air. He turned, his piercing blue eyes widening in surprise. Sarah? What's, planning something fun with my ex, are we? Sarah's words were laced with acrid sarcasm, her hands planted firmly on her hips. Whoa, Sarah. Jake held up his hands, a clear sign of surrender. You've got it all wrong. Then enlighten me, because from where I was standing, it looked like the two of you were hatching some grand scheme involving my bakery. Your bakery? Confusion crossed Jake's handsome features. No, it's not like that at all. Then what is it like, Jake? The hurt in Sarah's voice threatened to crack the facade of anger she clung to. Because right now, all I can see is you whispering with the one person who makes me angrier than anyone else in the world. Sarah, his tone softened, pleading for understanding. I just wanted to help. Help? She scoffed, her trust issues flaring. Or maybe tear down what I built, piece by piece? Listen to me. Jake stepped closer. That's not who I am. You know me better than that. Do I? She took an involuntary step back, feeling the walls she had meticulously built around her heart tremble. Because right now, I don't think I know anything at all. Let me explain, Jake insisted, reaching for her hand, but she snatched it away before he could make contact. Save it, Sarah snapped, the sting of betrayal clouding her judgment. I thought you were different, Jake. But maybe I was just fooling myself. With that, she turned on her heel. He'd gotten angry with her for even thinking of Mark, and here he was hanging out with the idiot? She knew she'd probably regret it later, but in that moment, she was done with all men. Sarah's abrupt departure left a ripple of tension in the air, and as she stood at the edge of the bar, Lola was the first to react. She shot a look toward Rachel, Danielle, and Natalie before they all converged around Sarah, forming a protective circle. Hey, Sarah, Lola said, her voice firm but gentle. You've got this all twisted up in your head, chica. Jake's not the enemy here. Rachel reached out, her hand lightly touching Sarah's arm. He seemed genuinely upset, Sarah. I don't think he'd ever do anything to hurt you or your bakery. Exactly, Danielle chimed in, her writer's mind already piecing together an alternate narrative. There's got to be another explanation. You know how these things can get blown out of proportion. Natalie gave a weary sigh, shifting her weight from one tired foot to the other. We're just trying to help, Sarah. But we need you to take a step back and consider that maybe you're reading too much into it. Sarah's gaze darted between her friends. But all she found was a chorus of well-meaning advice that felt more like a dismissal of her instincts than support. Their words, meant to ease her mind, only stoked the fires of doubt and betrayal. Of course, you all would side with him, Sarah retorted. I should have known better than to think anyone would take my side over Mr. Perfect's. Sarah, that's not fair, Lola countered, her brows knitting in frustration. We're not taking sides. We just want to make sure you're seeing things clearly. Seeing things clearly? Sarah repeated, incredulity lacing her tone. I heard them, plain as day. What part of that is me being unclear? Maybe you didn't hear the whole story, Rachel suggested, her experience as a single mother reminding her how easily misunderstandings could spiral. Or maybe I heard exactly what I needed to, Sarah snapped, the knot in her stomach growing tighter. The comfort she had always found in her friend's presence now seemed suffocating, their attempts at mediation feeling more like betrayal with each passing second. Sarah, please, Danielle pleaded. Just talk to him, without jumping to conclusions. Talk to him? Sarah scoffed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. So, he can weave some pretty little lie? I'm done talking. I'm done with all of this. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill over. She had come tonight hoping to find solace in the company of friends. Instead, she felt more isolated than ever, adrift in a sea of disloyalty. Fine. Sarah's voice cracked, the hurt too raw to contain. If you all trust him so much, then maybe I don't belong here after all. Without waiting for a response, she spun on her heel, leaving behind the concerned murmurs of her friends as she pushed through the crowd. Each step away from them felt like a step deeper into the unknown. The clack of her boots against the worn wooden floor of the bar sounded a sharp counterpoint to the turmoil churning in Sarah's chest as she made her escape. The cool night air hit her face as she burst through the exit, a temporary balm to the flush of anger and confusion. She wrapped her arms around her middle, hugging the warmth of indignation close as the door swung shut behind her. Sarah stumbled slightly on the uneven sidewalk, her vision blurred not by the tears she refused to shed but by the shimmering neon signs that lit up the main street of her small Texas hometown. I hate crying, she muttered under her breath, searching for a quiet corner away from the prying eyes and too loud sounds of Saturday night revelry. She found refuge beside the closed flower shop next door, its darkened windows reflecting a distorted image of a woman she hardly recognized. Leaning back against the cool brick wall, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe, deep, heaving breaths that sought to calm the storm within her chest. Her hair fell like a curtain as she tilted her head back, trying to focus on the stars peeking through the thin veil of clouds above. Get a grip, Sarah, she whispered to herself. You're stronger than this. But strength felt like a fleeting commodity, one that had been spent and lost amid accusations and misunderstandings. She closed her eyes, attempting to piece together the fragments of conversation she'd overheard, each snippet now a jagged edge that cut deep into her trust. Plan and Sarah's bakery played on loop in her mind, an insidious melody that threatened to undo her. She thought of Jake. What was he planning? And why with her ex, of all people? A gust of wind rustled the leaves along the sidewalk, and Sarah shivered, not from the cold but from the loneliness that wrapped around her like a second skin. Alone with her thoughts, she couldn't help but wonder if her past was coloring her present, turning potential love stories into tragedies before they could even begin. Jake wouldn't do that to you, would he? The question hung in the air, unanswered. She wished she could believe in him, in them, but doubt was relentless. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this, she admitted to the darkness, the weight of her words settling heavily in her heart. Love seemed a language she couldn't quite master, a dance she was always a step behind in. maybe, but the thought trailed off into the night. Sarah took another deep breath, steeling herself against the vulnerability that threatened to consume her. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself as she sat on the edge of the fountain outside the bar, the water's gentle babbling a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. "Come on, Sarah," she muttered to herself, "you've read the signs wrong before. Remember when you thought Mrs. Henderson wanted a carrot cake and she actually said parrot cake for her parrot's birthday? Maybe you're doing that now, misreading. But what if she wasn't?" The sound of footsteps approached, pulling her from her reverie. Turning slightly, she saw Jake's silhouette. His face was etched with concern, the kind that reached his eyes and erased any practiced pretense. "Sarah," he said. "We need to talk." Her chest tightened, a blend of fear and hope mingling. She wanted to believe him, to throw caution to the wind and embrace the possibility of something real. Sarah found herself poised to run or confront, unsure which instinct would win. "Talk then," she challenged softly, bracing herself for whatever he had to say. Jake took a hesitant step closer, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jeans as if searching for hidden courage. She remained still, her arms folded defensively across her chest, her posture betraying the storm within. "Look, I know this looks bad," Jake began, his voice earnest, "but it's not what you think. Isn't it?" Sarah's words came out sharper than she intended, the sting of betrayal fresh in her mind. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "No, Sarah, it's not. I was talking to your ex because he's been planning something that actually involves, well, you and your bakery." "Planning what?" Her skepticism was palpable, but curiosity edged the corners of her voice. "Okay, here goes nothing," Jake sighed, meeting her gaze with an openness that disarmed her. "You know how I told you I was talking about starting a dude ranch? Well, now that Mark is the head coach at the high school, he wants to take all the coaches there, and he said he wanted to help you by having a sweet treat box in all the coaches' rooms when they arrive." "Jake, Please, let me finish." He held up a hand. "Mark said he owes you an apology, and this was his way of doing it, but he wanted to run it by me first, because my agreement would be necessary." Sarah felt the tight knot in her stomach begin to unravel, guilt mingling with relief. "Really?" "Yeah." A sheepish smile touched his lips. "And I'm sorry for the way I acted when you admitted you were thinking about him. I shouldn't have walked out that night." "Jake, Words failed her, the roller coaster of emotions leaving her dizzy. "I was thinking about how purple his face would turn if I wrapped my fingers around his throat." She shook her head. "I'm sorry for jumping to conclusions. I guess I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop and for you to tell me that you're done with me. Like Mark did." "Hey, it's okay." He stepped forward. "I get it. Trust has to be earned, and I haven't been very trustworthy lately. First I kept secrets, and then I was hanging out with your ex." Her eyes searched his, finding only the truth and a hint of hope. "I've been burned before," she confessed, a whisper against the night air. "I know." His voice was soft, reassuring. "And I'm not asking for blind trust. Just a chance to prove myself, one step at a time. Maybe I can start by not running away when things get tough?" A tentative smile tugged at her lips. "Maybe we both can," he agreed. As they stood there, the weight of misunderstandings lifting, Sarah realized that he was worth fighting for. And with if it came to that. Chapter 11. Jake followed her to her front door, and they stepped inside. "Home sweet home," she murmured, tossing her keys onto a small, cluttered entryway table that held an array of cookie tins and mail. Jake couldn't help but smile at the sight, feeling a comforting sense of belonging wash over him. As Sarah led him through the cozy living room, he took in the soft pastel walls adorned with pictures of smiling faces and framed recipes. His heart raced when they reached her bedroom, a sanctuary of soft light and gentle colors. He watched her as she turned to face him, her hair cascading down her shoulders. "Jake," she said softly. "Sarah," he replied. They came together, their lips meeting in a kiss. Clothes fell to the floor. They made love with a tenderness that belied the fierce need thrumming through their veins, each touch, each sigh, a testament to the connection that had grown between them, rooted deep and blooming bright. Sarah slipped from the bed and padded softly to the kitchen, hips swaying slightly, the memory of their union still dancing across her skin. The sizzle of eggs hitting the pan broke the silence of the early morning, and the aroma of strong coffee soon mingled with the sweetness lingering in the air. Jake emerged, his hair tousled from sleep and a lazy grin spreading across his face. "Something smells incredible," he said, leaning against the doorway, watching her move around the kitchen. "Sit down, cowboy," Sarah teased. "You're about to have the best breakfast of your life, before I head out to the bakery." He did as told, settling at the small kitchen table that was already set for two. "Thank you," Jake said earnestly, "for everything." "Thank you for staying," Sarah replied. As she looked into his piercing blue eyes, she realized that sometimes the sweetest things in life weren't dusted with sugar. The bell above the bakery door chimed as Sarah breezed in, keys jangling with a purposeful energy. Through the glass window, Jake watched her tie an apron around her waist. He lingered outside, his hands in his pockets, the morning air still carrying the coolness of dawn. "Morning, donuts," he muttered to himself with a smirk, pushing open the door. He watched as she kneaded. "Jake?" she asked, surprised to see him there. "Thought I'd be where the magic happens," he said, leaning against the counter with easy charm. "Plus, I couldn't let you face Saturday's rush alone." She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to greet him properly, but the bell chimed again, signaling another arrival. Mark stood in the doorway. His eyes sought Sarah's immediately. Jake tensed, ready to stand between them if need be, but Mark raised a hand in peace. "Sarah, I won't take much of your time." Mark's voice was steady. "I've been doing some thinking, a lot actually, and well." He swallowed hard, glanced at Jake, then back to her. "I'm sorry for all I've done. Truly. It's clear to me now that you're happier with Jake than you ever were with me." "Thank you, Mark," Sarah responded. "I appreciate your apology. And I'll step away, for good this time." Mark gave a nod toward Jake, something akin to respect flickering in his gaze. "You're a good man, and she deserves the best. Take care of her. Make sure you contact me about the team building I'm planning at your ranch." With that, Mark turned on his heel and left as quickly as he had come. Sarah let out a breath, her shoulders relaxing visibly. "Looks like you're stuck with me now, cowboy," she said. "Stuck with you?" Jake grinned. "Darlin', there's nowhere else I'd rather be." That evening, Sarah went with Jake to his ranch, which she'd never seen. The day's heat was fading into a comforting warmth as Jake led her to the back porch, where a grill stood ready for their dinner. "Hope you're hungry," Jake said with that easy smile of his. From a cooler beside him, he retrieved a container of potato salad, its label cheerfully proclaiming it to be from the local Kroger's deli. "Starving," Sarah replied, leaning against the railing and watching him grill the steaks. There was something undeniably attractive about a man who could handle a grill with such confidence. In no time at all, Jake plated the steaks, calling her over to join him at the kitchen table. His kitchen was a thing of rustic beauty, spacious and welcoming, with warm wood tones and modern appliances that seemed to beckon anyone with a love for cooking. "Wow, this kitchen is amazing," she exclaimed, taking in the stone countertops and the large island in the center. "Thanks," Jake replied. "Dad had it remodeled last year. I think he was kind of sweet on the nurse that was taking care of him, and she loved to cook." As they began to eat, Jake laid out his vision for the Dude Ranch. He talked about trail rides, bonfires, and giving city dwellers a taste of the simple life. Sarah listened intently, picturing families enjoying the sprawling beauty of Jake's land. "Sounds incredible, Jake. You've thought of everything." She took another bite of the perfectly cooked steak, savoring the flavor. "Almost everything," he corrected with a wink. "Still need someone to fill the air with the smell of fresh-baked bread and pastries in the morning." Sarah laughed, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks. "Well, I might know a baker who'd be up for the job." They chatted on, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine Jake had poured. It was comfortable and natural, and Sarah found herself more at ease than she had been in a long time. Seriously, though, she added, gesturing to the expansive room, I could cook up a storm in here. It's perfect. Then it's settled, Jake said, you'll just have to do that more often. Guess I will, she replied, her heart skipping a beat at the thought of many more evenings like this one, filled with good food and even better company. Jake leaned back in his chair as he watched Sarah toy with the last morsel of steak on her plate. Sarah, Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence, how about making it official? Be the baker for the ranch. Our guests would go nuts for your pastries. Her eyes lit up like the stars appearing outside the window. I'd love that, she replied, her heart fluttering at the thought of her baked goods being part of this grand adventure. Imagine waking up to the smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee every morning. Exactly my point, he chuckled. Nothing says home like something sweet from the oven. They cleared the dishes, their movements synchronized in the spacious kitchen, and wandered into the living room where they settled onto the cozy couch. An idea sparked in Sarah's mind, as vibrant and sudden as lightning on a clear night. Jake, what if we turn one of the bedrooms into a library, she suggested, enthusiasm coloring her voice. For the guests, I mean, they could unwind with a book after a day of writing and roping. He nodded, intrigued. I like where you're going with this. A little reading nook. Maybe some classics, a few modern bestsellers. Like yours, she agreed, then added, and Danielle's books. She writes amazing Western romances. It would be perfect for the theme. Brilliant. His eyes shone with admiration. A couple of local authors featured right here on the ranch. That's good thinking, Sarah. Wait, there's more, she continued. Danielle could even bring her writer friends for retreats. Call it a work trip, but they'd be soaking up the real Western experience while they write. Look at you, full of ideas. Jake's grin was infectious. Who knew my cattle ranch would inspire a literary hub? Life's full of surprises, she said, her smile mirroring his. Just like that, the blueprint of their dream stretched out before them, each suggestion weaving a thread into the tapestry of what could be. As the possibilities unfurled between them, Jake reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. With you here, I think this place could become something special. The clock had ticked well past midnight when Jake finally stood up, stretching his arms and inadvertently showcasing the lean muscles under his flannel shirt. Sarah watched an appreciative glint in her eye. The living room was littered with papers scribbled with ideas, and the air was thick with the scent of possibility, and the faintest hint of cinnamon from a candle that had burned down hours ago. Come on, Jake said, offering a hand to Sarah. I think it's time we called it a night. Good plan, she replied, taking his hand and allowing him to pull her to her feet. Their fingers remained entwined as he led her through the quiet house, the wooden floorboards creaking softly under their weight. As they ascended the staircase, anticipation built between them. Sarah stood on tiptoes to close the gap between them with a sweet kiss that promised much more. Jake responded immediately, deepening the kiss as he guided her toward the bedroom, their bodies moving together with familiarity. He closed the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to seal away the world. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Jake propped himself on one elbow and traced the outline of Sarah's face with his finger, a silent promise etched into the soft glow of the moonlight spilling through the window. Stay with me tonight, he asked, hope mingling with the warmth in his blue eyes. I'd love to, she whispered back, her heart swelling with a mixture of contentment and excitement for the future they were building together. They rose and walked toward the master bath, where a huge tub awaited them, its white porcelain gleaming in the dim light. Jake turned on the faucet, adjusting the temperature until steam began to rise gently from the water's surface. Together, they stepped into the tub, the hot water a delicious contrast to the cool air. Jake sat behind Sarah, pulling her back against his chest, his arms encircling her. She leaned her head back onto his shoulder, closing her eyes as she let out a contented sigh. This is perfect, Sarah murmured. Only because you're here, Jake replied, kissing the top of her head. She opened her eyes and gazed around the expansive bathroom, at the elegant fixtures and the tasteful art on the walls. It all felt so right, so her. Jake? Yeah? Thank you for bringing me here, into your life, into your home. I can't imagine being anywhere else. Sarah, there's no place I'd rather have you than right here with me. Wrapped in a fluffy white robe with her hair still damp from the bath, Sarah's heart felt light, buoyant even, as she glanced at Jake sprawled comfortably across the bed, his eyes closed and a serene expression on his face. She smiled to herself, thinking how just a few short weeks ago, she wouldn't have dared to dream of this moment, of being here, with him, so deeply content. With a gentle tap of her fingers on the screen, she brought her phone to life and opened the group chat that had gone neglected. Hey guys, I owe you all an apology, she started typing, her thumbs moving quickly across the keyboard. I've been a mess lately, but I want you to know that Jake and I have made up. Sarah paused, considering her next words carefully. She knew her friends had only wanted the best for her, even when she was too stubborn to see it. And you were all right, she continued, the admission a tiny pinch to her pride. I was wrong. The blue bubbles popped up almost immediately, her friends' responses coming in a flurry of forgiveness, emojis, and exclamations. Let's meet for lunch tomorrow, she suggested, hoping to bridge the gap her recent behavior had undoubtedly caused. Sounds great, came the first response, followed by a chorus of agreements and suggestions for their favorite town eatery. Perfect, noon at the Rustic Spoon? Can't wait to see you all. Sarah confirmed. As the conversation wound down, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the weekend in San Antonio that seemed both a lifetime ago and just yesterday. They didn't know about the romantic dinner or the enchanting boat tour along the river walk. A smile tugged at her lips as she imagined their reactions to her news, the surprise, the squeals, the endless questions. Everything okay? Jake's voice, groggy with sleep, pulled her attention back to the present. Couldn't be better, she assured him. Just making plans with the girls for lunch tomorrow. Good. He yawned, wrapping an arm around her. They're important to you. They are, she agreed, nestling closer to his warmth. And so are you, Jake. In the dim light of the bedroom, Sarah felt the last piece of her world click into place. Whatever tomorrow would bring, she was ready for it, surrounded by love and buoyed by the promise of new beginnings. The clink of silverware and the murmur of lunchtime chatter surrounded Sarah as she slid into the booth at the Rustic Spoon. Her friends' faces were an open book of anticipation, their eyes wide with curiosity. Sorry I'm late, Sarah apologized, but the impish grin on her face betrayed her lack of genuine contrition. Girl, you've been glowing in your texts. Spill it. Lola urged, leaning forward over her iced tea. Okay, so Jake took me to this cozy little place on the river walk, right? Candlelit tables, live music, so romantic. Sarah's voice was a warm caress as she painted the picture of her weekend getaway. Her friends leaned in closer, hanging on every word while their salads wilted untouched. Then, we did the boat tour. It was like something out of a movie, the lights reflecting on the water, his hand in mine. Sarah trailed off, lost for a moment in the memory. Wait, that's not all, Sarah continued, nonchalantly stabbing a crouton with her fork. I also, lost my virginity. 4 forks clattered against plates in unison. Sarah Thompson, gasped Danielle, her voice rising above the din. Lost your, on purpose? Rachel asked, eyebrows knitting in confused delight. Yep, Sarah replied casually, as if discussing the weather, before adding, oh, and we went to SeaWorld, too. The dolphins were cute. A barrage of questions erupted from the group, each more eager than the last to delve into the details of Sarah's intimate revelation. Was it amazing? Did it hurt? How was Jake? Lola asked. Did you guys use protection? Was it better than chocolate cake? Natalie asked. Better than chocolate cake? Danielle interjected, her pen hovering over the notebook she'd whipped out from her purse. Hold up, I need to get all of this down. She looked up, her wavy brown hair framing her earnest expression. I write so many first-time sex scenes, but I'm still a virgin. This is good stuff. Okay, Sarah laughed, her cheeks flushing with a mix of embarrassment and excitement. One question at a time. And yes, Danielle, better than chocolate cake. As the interrogation unfolded, Sarah felt the joy of her new experiences mingling with the comfort of friendship. Surrounded by laughter and light-hearted teasing, she knew there was no place she would rather be than here, sharing the most significant moments of her life with the people who mattered most. Chapter 12. Sarah was kneading dough, her hands moving with practiced ease, but her mind was elsewhere. Each time she glanced over at Jake, nestled in the corner with his laptop, a pang of worry clutched at her heart. "More coffee?" she asked, voice lilting hopefully as she approached his table with a steaming pot. Sure," Jake mumbled without looking up, the blue light from his screen casting ghostly shadows across his focused face. Sarah poured the dark liquid, her eyes lingering on him, tracing the furrow between his brows that had become more pronounced with each passing day. Once, his eyes would have flickered up and locked with hers, sparking silent conversations. Now, there was just the click-clack of keys and a chasm growing silently between them. "Jake," she started, then hesitated. "Is everything all right?" He paused briefly, nodding without meeting her gaze. "Yeah, just busy." His words were brusque, clipped by concentration. "Okay," Sarah whispered to herself more than to him, retreating to the counter where a tray of pastries awaited her attention. She watched him from the display case, the way his hair fell into his eyes, and how he'd absently brush it aside. Each movement seemed weighed down, like he was shouldering the world alone, and her heart ached to share the burden. Baking was her solace, yet even the sweet aroma couldn't mask the bitter taste of distance. As the afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting a warm glow over the room, Sarah forced a smile for her customers. It didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah bustled about the bakery, dusting flour from her apron as she balanced a tray of cinnamon rolls fresh from the oven. She glanced over at Jake, hunched over his laptop in his usual corner, a crease of concentration etching deeper into his forehead with each passing day. "Jake, you gotta eat something," she said, nudging a steaming roll toward him along with a cup of black coffee, just the way he liked it. He looked up, momentarily dazed, as if surfacing from an underwater cave. "Thanks, Sarah," he murmured, giving her a fleeting, distracted smile that didn't quite reach his eyes before diving back into his work. "Sure thing," Sarah replied, though her heart sank just a tad. She missed their banter, the easy exchange they used to have over coffee and scones. Now there was only the clatter of keys and the occasional sigh of frustration from Jake's direction. As Sarah wiped down the counters, she couldn't help stealing glances at him. He had this rugged charm, even more pronounced now with the weight of the world seemingly on his shoulders. His jeans were perpetually dust-stained these days, his boots scuffed from traipsing back and forth between the ranch and the bakery. The cabins for the Dude Ranch were taking shape, but she knew the financial strain was taking its toll. Every so often, he'd run a hand through his hair, pushing it back in exasperation. It was endearing and heartbreaking all at once. Sarah knew about the loans he'd taken out for more horses, the sleepless nights spent wrestling words onto pages to finish his book. He was stretched thinner than pie dough on Thanksgiving. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked after a little while, her voice hopeful. No, I'm good," Jake replied without looking up. "This is perfect." "Alrighty then." She turned away, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The bakery hummed with the mid-morning rush, yet Sarah felt a pang of loneliness amidst the laughter and chatter of her customers. She watched him for a moment longer, the man who had become both her beacon of hope and the source of her quiet sorrows. Jake was always there, yet somehow, not there at all, but she held on to the thread of his presence, knowing he wouldn't choose to hang out in the bakery if he didn't want to be around her. "Let me know if you change your mind," she called out. "Will do," Jake said absently, his gaze never leaving the screen. With a nod and a small sigh, Sarah returned to her baking, rolling out dough and shaping dreams, all the while hoping for the day when Jake would resurface from his obligations and truly see her again. The chime above the bakery door heralded another day's end, and with it, Sarah glanced hopefully toward the corner where Jake sat entrenched in his digital fortress. "Ready to call it a night," she ventured, wiping her hands on her apron. "Actually, I should probably get back." Jake started, his voice trailing off as he began to pack up. "Sure," Sarah said, a little too quickly. "Rain check, then?" Definitely, he replied, though they both knew the rain checks were piling up. She watched him hurry out and couldn't help but wonder when he'd have a little time for her again. Then one afternoon a sudden exclamation sliced through the monotony. Jake leaned back so far in his chair she thought it might topple, his hands shooting skyward as if to scoop the joy right out of the air. "I'm done." His voice cracked with a blend of exhaustion and elation. "Done?" Sarah echoed, her heart skipping a beat. "Done," he affirmed, a grin breaking through the stress. The room seemed to breathe with him, the atmosphere lightening, and in that instant, Sarah saw a glimmer of the man she'd fallen for, the Jake unburdened by deadlines and debt. "Jake," she began, her voice threading through the warm, dough-scented air of her little sanctuary. "With what?" Her brow furrowed gently. His laugh was airy and light. He rotated his chair to face her, his eyes finally meeting hers with unshielded enthusiasm. "The book, Sarah. The book is finished." His hands, which so often flew across the keyboard in a blur, now lay still on the worn wood of the table. "It's done, and it's going to be big." "Big?" she echoed, hope flickering in her. "Big enough to pay off every last cent for the horses and cabins," he said, the weight of worry lifting visibly from his shoulders. "I'm talking dude ranch dreams coming true, without the nightmare of debt hanging over us." "Us?" Sarah's heart hitched at the inclusion, her smile spreading as she leaned against the counter. "I like the sound of that." "Us," he confirmed, standing up to close the distance between them. "Because let's face it, I've been banking on your cookies to bring in the crowds too." Her laughter mingled with his, light and free, as they shared a moment of joy amidst the flour and fondant. Later, Sarah slipped her arm through Jake's as they exited the bakery. "Come on, cowboy," she teased, giving his arm a gentle tug toward her old pickup. "I'm taking you out for the finest steak in town." Jake chuckled, allowing himself to be led. "You know, I think this might be the first real date we've had in weeks that didn't involve coffee stains or sugar dust." "Consider it an overdue indulgence," Sarah replied with a playful grin. They settled into a cozy booth at an out-of-the-way, hole-in-the-wall restaurant known for its down-home charm and mouth-watering cuisine. As soon as they were seated, Sarah reached across the table, covering Jake's hand with her own. "I hope you know, despite the radio silence, how proud I am of you," she said earnestly. "What you've accomplished." "Thank you, Sarah." "That means everything coming from you," Jake responded, his piercing blue eyes softening. "But there's something I need to lay out on the table." She nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Finishing the book is just a part of it. It's going to pay off the loans for the ranch expansions, sure, but it's not a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow," he explained. "When all is said and done, I'll be broke, but not buried under a mountain of debt." "It's a fresh start, Sarah." "Being broke is just a moment in time," she said confidently. "But being free of debt? That's a leap toward the future." "Our future." "Exactly," Jake agreed, the corners of his eyes crinkling with genuine contentment. "And that's what I'm celebrating tonight. Not just the end of a book, but the beginning of us. Without any anchors holding us down." Their meals arrived, the scent of seasoned steak filling the air between them, but it was the possibility of a life without financial chains that truly satisfied them. They ate and laughed, talking about everything and nothing, the connection between them as palpable as the flavors dancing on their tongues. Jake pushed the last bite of pecan pie across his plate with his fork, his gaze lingering on Sarah with an intensity that made her heart skip. The candlelight flickered, casting a soft glow over the table and lending an almost magical atmosphere to the moment. "Sarah," he began, leaning in, the playful spark in his eyes turning into something more earnest. "There's something I've got to do soon, and it's pretty important." She dabbed at the corners of her mouth with her napkin, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "My publisher, they're setting up a book tour. It's going to be a whirlwind of cities, signing books, and meeting readers. And, well," he hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I want you there with me. What do you say we call it our honeymoon?" The suggestion hung in the air. Her spoon clattered against her plate, the sound sharp against the murmur of the restaurant. "Honeymoon," she echoed, her voice a mix of amusement and disbelief. Jake Williams, are you forgetting something? We're not even engaged yet. Her words were teasing, but there was an undercurrent of something else, a question, perhaps, about where they stood. The playful banter they often shared now carried the weight of their unspoken hopes and dreams for the future. Jake reached across the table, capturing her hand in his touch as warm and reassuring as the Texas sun. Well, about that. Jake's fingers brushed against the cool metal concealed in his pocket, a secret waiting to burst forth like the first bloom of spring. The corners of his mouth lifted into a half-smile, the same one that had always set Sarah's heart racing. Even now, as confusion flickered in her eyes, he knew it was time to bridge the gap that had grown between them. Sarah, he began. His hand withdrew from his pocket, holding the promise of forever cradled between his thumb and forefinger. I've been doing a lot of thinking, about us, about the future. She watched, breath caught somewhere between hope and hesitation, as he opened his palm. There, glinting under the dim lights of the restaurant, lay a simple yet elegant ring. It was like Jake, unassuming but with a depth that called out to be explored. Will you marry me, Sarah Thompson? His voice carried the hint of a tremble, the only sign of his nervousness. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation, even the distant twang of country music fading into insignificance. Sarah's gaze flitted from the ring to the man before her. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure, the single syllable carrying all the love and certainty of a heart that had found its match. Yes, I will marry you, Jake Williams. I love you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, laughter bubbled up between them, light and free. I love you more. Epilogue. 10 years later. Sarah gently rocked on the back porch swing. With a tender smile, she watched Jake and their boys, laughter mingling with the sound of hammers and nails, as they constructed what promised to be the grandest playhouse the backyard had ever seen. Mama, can you make it fit? The soft voice of her little girl pulled Sarah's attention away from the boys' antics. Sarah looked down into the bright eyes of her daughter, who held out a Barbie dressed in an unruly tangle of pink satin that refused to meet at the back. Of course, sweet pea, Sarah said, her fingers deftly working the tiny buttons through equally tiny buttonholes. Her daughter watched, fascinated, as if Sarah were performing the most intricate of magic tricks. Like this, see? Sarah whispered, finishing with a flourish and handing the now impeccably dressed doll back to her daughter. The little girl beamed, clutching the doll to her chest. Thank you, Mama, she chirped, bouncing slightly on the swing, her legs kicking back and forth in excitement. Catherine, who they'd taken to calling Cat, was only 4, and she loved her Barbies. Sarah's heart swelled, her gaze drifting back to the construction crew of 3. Jake caught her eye just then, and for a moment, time seemed to hover still. The corner of his mouth lifted in a knowing smile, the blue of his eyes twinkling with an unspoken connection. In that silent exchange, there was an entire conversation, one filled with the comfort of shared memories and the quiet delight in the life they'd built together. Watch your fingers, boys. Jake called out to their Jesse and Sebastian, but his smile lingered for Sarah, a private moment amidst the joyful chaos of family life. Jake hammered the final nail into the wooden beam, then stood back to admire the playhouse's frame. Wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, he leaned against the structure, a sense of accomplishment washing over him. He glanced over at Sarah again, who was talking with their daughter. A chuckle escaped him as he shook his head. It seemed like another lifetime when the roar of Dallas traffic filled his ears. The city's fast pace, the endless ambition that drove him, it all felt so distant now. He was still writing, but it wasn't as fast as he had been. Instead, the ranch supported them, and his writing was filling up the college funds they'd started for each of the 3 children. Here, among the hammering sounds and the sweetness of home-baked bread wafting from the kitchen, Jake found a different kind of rhythm, one he never knew he'd been searching for until it enveloped him completely. Lookin' good, Dad, his eldest son called out, bringing Jake back to the present. Thanks, Bud, Jake responded, tossing him a thumbs up. His fingers itched to hold a keyboard instead of a hammer, reminding him of the book he was currently working on in the quiet hours before dawn or late at night after the kids had gone to bed. Writing was his solace, the way he untangled his thoughts, weaving them into stories that other people might find solace in too. Meanwhile, Sarah had transformed their home into more than just living quarters. The aroma of fresh pastries and bread filled the air each morning as she ran her bakery from the spacious kitchen. It allowed her to be there when the kids came home from school, her warm presence a constant in their bustling lives. "Hey, you sure you don't need help with that?" Sarah called out to him from the porch, an impish grin dancing on her lips. "Got it under control, babe," Jake replied, though he wouldn't have minded her company. He watched as she turned back to the children, ready to tend to their next adventure or mishap, whichever came first. The thought of her flitting about the house, apron dusted with flour, her laughter mingling with the clatter of baking trays, was enough to convince him that the dreams he once had paled in comparison to the reality he lived now. This was where he was meant to be, building playhouses, writing novels, and watching his children grow, all with Sarah by his side. "Looks great, Daddy," one of his sons yelled, clambering up the ladder to peek inside the playhouse's window. "Careful there, cowboy," Jake cautioned with an easy chuckle, his gaze drifting over to the back porch where Sarah sat, their daughter nestled beside her. "Mama, look. I'm so high up," the boy called out again, aiming to capture his mother's attention. "Be careful, honey," Sarah responded, her voice carrying the same warmth that always seemed to wrap around him like a well-worn blanket. As Sarah helped their little girl tug a pink dress onto her Barbie, Jake could not help but marvel at how seamlessly she moved through life's challenges, her hands ever so gentle, yet confident and sure. He remembered the days when the clink of measuring cups and the whir of the mixer were the soundtrack to their early mornings, the scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh bread lingering between them like a promise. In her, he discovered an unwavering support system, someone who believed in his dreams. Just as he'd always believed in hers. "Looking good, Dad," another voice chimed in, drawing Jake's attention back to the task at hand as his other son, Jesse, offered a thumbs up. "Thanks, Bud," Jake replied, his heart swelling with pride. Jake set aside his tools and ambled over to the porch. He lowered himself onto the swing beside Sarah, an arm instinctively wrapping around her shoulders as they both watched their children play. "Perfect end to a perfect day," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of Sarah's head. "Every day is perfect with you," she whispered back, leaning into his embrace. And in that moment, Jake knew without a shadow of a doubt that life was indeed good. Better than good, it was everything he had ever hoped for and more.